At my son's luxury wedding, my new daughter-in-law slapped my wife across the face in front of 400 elite guests. She glanced down at my wife's bleeding cheek and ordered her to leave, convinced we were just a pair of washed-up retirees who had no business being there. My son stood motionless and let it happen. What he had no way of knowing was that a single phone call from me was all it would take to obliterate his future, strip her family of their estate, and reduce their dream wedding to a federal crime scene. My name is Cornelius, 75 years old, and the silent hand behind one of the biggest private commercial real estate empires in Houston. Welcome back to Family Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me today. If these stories of loyalty, betrayal, and hard-fought justice resonate with you, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed and gave this one a like. It helps more people find us. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you in the comments. Who are you already rooting for and why? Now, a quick note, some elements of this story have been fictionalized for dramatic storytelling purposes, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is entirely coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. The violinist drew her bow to a halt, while the pianist pressed both palms flat across the keys to kill the sound. The silence that crashed down in their wake was heavier than a concrete vault. I was standing 10 ft away, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water, when I watched my wife of 50 years, Vivienne, lurch backward. Her custom designer glasses slipped from her face and exploded against the imported Italian marble floor. The crack of shattering glass rang out like a gunshot through that suffocating quiet, every one of the 400 guests frozen where they stood. Time seemed to slow to an absolute crawl. I watched the shards scatter outward across the floor, catching the light thrown down by the massive crystal chandeliers overhead. I turned my eyes to Vivienne. She pressed her fingers to her cheek, where a thin line of deep red had begun to trail down her dark skin, cut open by the massive diamond engagement ring I had paid for just 6 months ago. Vivienne was 74 years old, but she moved through any room like royalty. We had clawed our way up from nothing together on the unforgiving streets of this city, each of us working 3 jobs at a time just to keep the lights on in a tiny apartment decades ago. She was the woman who packed my lunches when I was pouring concrete in freezing rain. She was the woman seated beside me in the boardroom the morning we made our first million. In all our years together, not one person had ever raised a hand to her until tonight. Standing over her was Paige, my brand new daughter-in-law, 26 years old, wrapped in a custom silk gown that cost more than most people earn in 5 years. The face that had been smiling flawlessly for the cameras all evening had twisted into something ugly, a mask of pure, arrogant disgust. "Get out of here, old woman," Paige said, her voice cutting clean and sharp through the dead silence of the ballroom. "Nobody wants you here. You are ruining my perfect day." Paige came from a family in Savannah that claimed old money. The kind of people who showed you their teeth when they smiled, but looked at you like something scraped off the bottom of their shoe. Paige had convinced herself she was doing my son a favor by marrying him, that her so-called high society pedigree was a gift she was bestowing on our black family. She had me pegged as a retired blue-collar contractor who got lucky with a handful of modest investments. She saw my wife and me as a stain on her carefully curated image. She had absolutely no idea that the very ground beneath her feet, the $5,000 a night luxury estate hosting this reception, was held by a shell company registered entirely in my name. I cut my eyes toward the VIP tables where Paige's parents Gerard and Loretta were seated. Neither of them looked surprised. Neither one moved to apologize for their daughter's violent, unprovoked outburst. Loretta lifted her martini glass and took a slow, unhurried sip, while Gerard leaned toward the man beside him and murmured something with a thin smirk on his lips. They were perfectly at ease watching their daughter humiliate a black woman in front of a room full of people. To them, we were simply the ones bankrolling the evening. We were not peers. We were a convenient stepping stone, a means for their cash-strapped family to keep their gilded facade intact. My gaze moved to my son Damon, 28 years old, standing less than 3 feet away from the woman who had just put her hand across his mother's face. This was the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had spent years shielding from every sharp edge the world had to offer. I had spent 50 years raising an empire, so that my son would never have to lower his head for anyone. I handed him the finest education, the best clothes, and access to the most exclusive circles in Houston. But in my drive to protect him from every hardship, I had unknowingly stripped him of his backbone. I waited for him to move. I waited for the rage that ought to live in the gut of any man who just watched his mother get struck. I waited for him to step forward to take hold of his wife's arm, to demand she apologize, to clear her from the room. I waited for him to show me that the blood in his veins was mine. Damon did absolutely nothing. He locked up completely. His gaze dropped to his expensive Italian leather shoes. He gripped his crystal champagne flute so hard his knuckles blanched, but he would not raise his head. Would not look at his bleeding mother. Would not look at me. The cowardice coming off him was like a smell in the air. He was picking his side, and he was doing it through trembling, pathetic silence. He was choosing the illusion of acceptance from this racist, bankrupt family over the mother who had kissed his bruised knees and sat up through the night every time fever took him as a child. In that single frozen moment, 28 years of a father's unconditional love evaporated without a sound. What moved in to fill the void was not grief. I felt no urge to weep. What replaced it was cold, steel-edged clarity. I understood then that my son was no victim in this marriage. He was a willing participant. By standing motionless, he was ratifying the disrespect. He was signaling to this arrogant girl that she had standing permission to treat us like something beneath her heels. He was making it plain that he was entirely unworthy of the legacy I had bled to build. I did not raise my voice. I did not lunge at the girl or grab my son by his tailored lapels and shake him. Men who build empires from the ground up do not perform for a crowd. We don't scream and weep and hand our enemies a window into our emotions. We calculate. Then we execute. I set both glasses of sparkling water down on the tray of a passing waiter with hands that did not tremble. I crossed the marble floor at an unhurried pace. The crowd of wealthy elites parted ahead of me as though the air itself had given way. No one spoke. Every eye in the room tracked the old man walking toward the bride. I lowered myself old joints, and all directly in front of Paige's white shoes. I collected the broken fragments of Vivian's glasses from the floor so no one would be cut. Then I drew a clean linen pocket square from the inside pocket of my tailored suit and pressed it gently to my wife's cheek, blotting the line of blood. Vivian looked at me. Her eyes held no tears. They were perfectly still. After 50 years of marriage and building a dynasty side by side from nothing, she could read my mind without a word spoken between us. In business, we had built contingency plans for every conceivable threat. A few years back, we had constructed one for the family trust as well. A plan engineered to excise the rot the moment a branch became infected. She laid her warm hand over mine and gave one slow nod. A quiet, ironclad agreement between two partners. The gloves were off. I rose back to my full height. I looked directly at Paige. She lifted her chin and folded her arms, a smirk pulling at the corner of her mouth. She was waiting for me to erupt. She wanted the angry black man to surface so she could perform helplessness for the wealthy white relatives watching from the VIP tables. She was angling for a scene, something that would give security a reason to remove us from our own son's wedding. I gave her nothing at all. My face was carved stone. I turned my eyes to Damon, who managed to hold my gaze for the span of a breath, before shame sent his eyes skittering away. I said nothing to him. There was nothing left to say. He was already gone to me. He was no longer my heir. He was a stranger wearing a suit I had paid for. I reached into my jacket and drew out my phone. I dialed a private encrypted line that connected directly to my lead wealth manager, a man compensated very well to be reachable 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It rang once before he picked up. I kept my eyes fixed on Paige's smug face as I spoke 3 words into the phone. Execute Directive 0. I ended the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. Paige let out a small, condescending laugh, clearly writing me off as an old man performing importance to salvage his dignity in front of her circle. She assumed I was calling a car to take my wife home. But that laugh died in her throat moments later. A heavy mechanical clunk resonated through the grand hall. The thick oak double doors at the ballroom's entrance had just slammed shut, and the electronic deadbolts engaged from the outside. The green exit signs above the doors switched to red. Nobody was going anywhere. The game had only just begun. 10 seconds elapsed after those heavy oak doors locked shut. Paige was still planted on the dance floor with that arrogant smirk, completely unaware that the floor beneath her expensive silk shoes was seconds away from giving way. Then it happened. The grand ballroom dropped into absolute darkness. The jazz music that had just resumed was severed mid-note, leaving nothing behind but a sickening mechanical hum vibrating through the air. All 400 elite guests gasped at once. A wave of panic rolled through the sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. These were the wealthiest people in Houston and Savannah, and being kept in the dark was not something any of them was accustomed to. 5 seconds later, the emergency lighting engaged, not the warm, amber glow of the crystal chandeliers that had draped the room in soft romance all evening. These were harsh, blinding, industrial fluorescent tubes, the kind of lights you see in a hospital corridor or a factory floor. They threw sharp, unforgiving shadows across the faces of the assembled socialites, making their expensive makeup look cheap and their panicked expressions look grotesque. The illusion of a flawless high society wedding dissolved on the spot. What replaced it was the cold, clinical reality of a lockdown. Paige spun in a full circle. Her head craned upward in pure bewilderment. Her carefully crafted aesthetic was in ruins. She barked at the waiters who had abruptly stopped circulating champagne, demanding to know what was happening. Damon, my spineless son, looked every bit as lost. He yanked out his phone, but there was no signal. The venue had been fitted with signal jammers for high-security corporate events, and Directive 0 had triggered every last one of them. We were sealed off from the outside world, and I was the only person in that room holding the switch. From the shadows near the catering kitchen, a figure stepped forward. His name was Terrence, a highly trained professional who had worked inside my private management firm for 10 years. He moved with a rigid military bearing a wireless microphone in hand. The harsh fluorescent light bounced off his shaved head. He did not look at the bride. He did not look at the groom. He did not spare a glance for the screaming guests. He looked directly at me. I gave him the smallest fraction of a nod. Terrence tapped the microphone twice. The dull thud rolled through the massive speakers, and the murmurs of the crowd went dead. "Ladies and gentlemen," Terrence said, his voice deep and utterly stripped of emotion, "may I have your immediate attention? Please remain calm. Due to an instant and catastrophic payment failure, all services for this event have been legally terminated. The catering staff, the musicians, and the hospitality crew are now off the clock. This private property is officially closed. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate the premises before local authorities arrive to arrest anyone remaining for criminal trespassing. Please move toward the exits in an orderly fashion." The silence that followed his words was total. Not one person drew a breath. Then the room detonated into chaos. Women in diamond necklaces shrieked. Men in custom suits turned on the staff, demanding answers. Paige stood frozen at the center of the dance floor, her jaw all but grazing the marble beneath her. She seized Damon's arm and shook him, screaming at him to fix this, to call the bank, to hurl his platinum credit card at the manager, to do whatever it took to salvage her perfect night. But Damon just stared into his wallet, understanding somewhere deep in his gut that every card inside it was tethered to the empire I had built, and I had just set that empire ablaze. Paige had made a fatal miscalculation the moment she decided to marry my son. She looked at me and saw an old black man who had worked with his hands. She knew I had started out as a blue-collar contractor decades ago, pouring concrete and patching roofs in the blistering Texas heat. She took me for a fortunate retiree who had scrimped and saved just enough to put my son through a decent school. She was convinced that she was the one importing prestige into this family, her hollow Savannah pedigree, the prize she was graciously offering us. She did not know that the concrete I poured became the bedrock of a real estate monopoly. She did not know that the holding company she had written the $5,000 a night check to for this luxury estate was just one of 30 shell companies registered in my name. I owned the manicured lawn she had glided across. I owned the crystal chandeliers suspended above her head. I owned the very marble floor on which she had sent my wife's glasses skittering in pieces. When she had insisted on booking this particular estate, the most exclusive venue in the state, I hadn't said a word. I let her sign the contract. I let her feel powerful. I wanted to see exactly who she was when she believed she held every card in the deck. Tonight, she revealed herself, and she walked straight into a steel trap I had assembled with my own 2 hands. Through the stampeding crowd, 2 figures forced their way forward with the blunt entitlement of people who had never been told no. Gerard and Loretta Page's parents. Gerard's face had gone the color of raw meat, the veins standing out on his neck. Loretta looked like a cornered animal, one hand white-knuckling her pearl necklace. Neither of them acknowledged the fact that my wife was standing beside me, pressing a bloodied cloth to her cheek. Neither of them registered that their daughter had just committed a violent assault. What consumed them was their public image, the humiliation of being ejected from a venue in full view of their country club circle. Gerard drove his way through the crowd and jabbed a finger inches from my face. "Listen to me, you old fool," he hissed, his voice shaking with rage. "I don't know what kind of cheap stunt you think you're pulling here, but I will personally see to it that you are finished. You are embarrassing my family. You are destroying my daughter's wedding. I know the mayor. I know the chief of police. I will drag you through the courts until you're sleeping on the pavement. I will sue you for every cent buried in that little retirement fund of yours." Loretta stepped in beside him, her voice a shrill note cutting straight through the noise of the evacuating crowd. "Fix this right now," she ordered, leveling a manicured finger at my chest. "Go and tell that manager to restore the lights and bring the food back out. You people are always derailing everything with your dramatic outbursts. Tell your wife to stop crying and go clean herself up so we can get on with the evening." You people. The words hung there in the air, dripping with generations of inherited arrogance. They were absolutely certain that their bloodline made them untouchable. They expected me to drop my head and comply the same way my son had done. They were blissfully unaware that Gerard was drowning beneath $15 million in corporate debt, struggling to prop up this pathetic wealthy facade. They were screaming at the man who quietly held the mortgage on their ancestral home. But I did not smile. I did not tell them who I was. Not yet. Psychological pressure delivered in measured doses was far more devastating than a single blow. I looked at Gerard. I looked at Loretta. I let the silence between us expand until it had weight, letting their furious words echo off the bare walls. I wanted them to carry this exact moment with them when they were one day standing before a bankruptcy judge. I wanted the memory of this night, the night they tried to intimidate a man who could purchase and discard their entire bloodline before his morning coffee to haunt them. I did not blink. I did not flinch from Gerard's outstretched finger. I simply looked through him as though he were made of glass. Then I turned my back on the most prominent man in Savannah without a single word crossing my lips. I placed my arm gently around Vivian's waist and drew her into my side. She was trembling not from fear, but from the pure adrenaline coursing through her. She kept her chin level, refusing to give these people the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Together, we walked toward the heavy oak doors which Terence had just unlocked to let the panicked flood of guests pour out into the night. Behind me, I heard Gerard's voice rising. He was shouting that I was a coward, that I was running away. Then I heard him tell Loretta to hand him his phone. He was dialing 911. He intended to report me to the police for destroying the wedding, to have me arrested for fraud. I kept walking, my arm held close around the woman I loved more than anything in this world. Gerard had no idea that his call to the police was precisely the outcome I had been engineering all along. The trap was fully laid, the doors were open wide, and the predators were about to discover what it felt like to be prey. The drive away from the estate was completely silent. Heavy rain hammered against the tinted windows of my town car, washing the last traces of what was meant to be a night of celebration into the gutter. I sat in the back seat beside Vivian, holding her hand. She still had my linen pocket square pressed firmly against her right cheek. The bleeding had slowed, but the cut left by Paige's massive diamond ring was deep. I told my driver to bypass our estate entirely and head straight to the emergency room at Houston Methodist Hospital. Vivian looked at me with a tired but knowing expression. She understood exactly why we were going there. This was not a trip for bandages or pain relief. We were going to construct a weapon. The law in the state of Texas is unambiguous on this point. Strike a 74-year-old woman, and you are not committing simple battery. You are committing a felony. It is classified as elder abuse. Wealthy white families like Paige's are accustomed to making problems vanish with a few well-placed calls and a generous check. They assume they can put their hands on a black woman and walk away clean because they believe we lack the resources to push back. But a certified medical report from an emergency room physician documenting an unprovoked assault on a senior citizen is a piece of paper that no volume of old money can make disappear. We walked through the bright entrance of the emergency room. The hard, fluorescent light inside was a jarring contrast to the dim elegance of the wedding venue we had just left. The nurses moved us immediately into a private examination room the moment they registered the blood on Vivian's face and the quality of the clothes we wore. A young doctor entered to clean the wound. He asked what had happened. I gave him no softened version of the truth. I did not reach for words that would shield my son's new wife. I looked the doctor square in the eye and told him that my wife had been deliberately struck across the face by a 26-year-old woman named Paige. I made certain he recorded the full name and the precise circumstances in his official medical chart. I stood in the corner of that small, sterile room and watched as a forensic nurse captured high-resolution photographs of the laceration on Vivian's cheek. They documented the bruising already spreading across her jaw. Every flash of the camera was another nail driven into Paige's coffin. I was laying the foundation for a criminal prosecution that would dismantle her life completely. I wanted every piece of evidence locked in place before her bankrupt father could retain a lawyer and start spinning a convenient fiction. The moment the doctor finished closing the cut and handed us the official paperwork, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Damon calling. I stared at his name on the screen and felt a cold wave of contempt move through me. My son had not once checked on his mother since the moment she hit the floor. He had not called to ask whether she was still bleeding, whether she was in pain, or whether she was even safe. He was calling because his carefully constructed world of unearned privilege was beginning to crack beneath him. I stepped out of the hospital room into the corridor and took the call. I offered no greeting. I just let the panic in his voice fill the line. Damon was standing at the Delta terminal inside George Bush Intercontinental Airport. He and his new bride were supposed to be boarding their flight for a 3-week honeymoon in the Seychelles, a trip that cost more than most people earn in an entire year, every cent of which I had funded. But now he was breathless and frantic, shouting into the phone. He demanded to know what was happening. He said they had tried to enter the exclusive VIP lounge and the attendant had cut his membership card in half right there in front of him. He was furious. He told me that when they reached the ticketing counter, the agent informed them that their first-class tickets to the Seychelles had been completely canceled and the reservations scrubbed from the system entirely. He was throwing a full-blown tantrum in the middle of one of the busiest airports in the world. He told me Paige was in tears beside him and that people were staring. He demanded that I call the airline immediately to correct the glitch. He actually used the word glitch. His entitlement was so deeply embedded that he was incapable of recognizing a consequence when it arrived. He genuinely believed the universe had made a clerical error. I let him shout and carry on for 2 full minutes. I stood in that hospital hallway, listening to his pathetic spiral while I watched through the door's small window as my beautiful wife held an ice pack to her bruised face. When he finally paused to breathe, I spoke. My voice was quiet and entirely stripped of any paternal warmth. I told him there was no glitch. I told him that I had personally canceled the honeymoon flights while we were in the car on the way to the hospital. Damon went completely silent. Then he began to stammer, asking me why I would do such a thing on his wedding night. I kept it simple. I told him that the black corporate Visa Infinite card in his wallet, the card that had been financing his entire lavish existence, was dead. The account was permanently closed. His trust fund was frozen, and his access to every family account had been fully revoked. I told him that the moment he stood still and watched a spoiled, arrogant girl put her hand across his mother's face, he stopped being a member of my family. And people outside my family do not spend my money. His shock curdled fast into something uglier. He started yelling again, but this time there was a tremor in his voice. He told me I was being unreasonable and irrational over a stupid argument. He actually referred to the unprovoked assault on his own mother as a stupid argument. He accused me of ruining his life and humiliating his wife. He threatened that he didn't need my money and that they would simply call a rideshare and return to his luxury penthouse in Midtown Houston to regroup in the morning. He promised me I would regret this when they removed me from their lives for good. I did not argue with him. I did not attempt to explain the scale of my disappointment or talk him through what he had done. He was far beyond that. A man who takes the side of the woman who drew his mother's blood deserves to lose everything he has. So I offered him the only reply his conduct had earned: complete and total silence. I pulled the phone from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting the call off right in the middle of his tirade. I blocked his number. I let him scream into nothing. I walked back into the hospital room and slipped the phone into my pocket. Vivian looked at me, and I gave her a single nod. She knew. The cord had been severed. There is a particular kind of grief that settles over you when you finally accept that your child is broken at the core. I had invested 28 years trying to build him into a man of substance and leadership, but as I helped Vivian back into her coat, I made peace with the hard truth. I had raised a parasite, and the only remedy for a parasite is to cut off its food supply entirely. We left the emergency room and stepped back into the cold, wet Houston night. My driver held the door, and we folded ourselves into the quiet of the car. I told him to take us home to our estate in River Oaks. As the city lights smeared past the windows, an unexpected calm settled over me. For years I had been carrying the dead weight of Damon's incompetence, quietly cleaning up his disasters, absorbing his staggering credit card bills, and rationalizing away the glaring defects in his character, because I wanted to believe he would one day grow into himself. Tonight, Paige had delivered me an unexpected gift. By striking my wife, she had shattered the last of my illusions in a single instant. She forced my eyes open to the true nature of the man my son had become. They believed they had won. They thought they could pocket my money and trample my blood beneath their feet. But they were playing checkers while I was arranging the final pieces on a chessboard they did not even know was in play. As my car glided toward the security of our gated estate, I opened my tablet and pulled up the surveillance network. Damon was arrogant and foolish, but above all else, he was predictable. True to his threat, he and Paige had taken a rideshare from the airport directly to the sleek, high-rise building in Midtown Houston, where his penthouse sat. He called it his penthouse, but his name appeared nowhere on the deed. It belonged to my real estate portfolio, fully integrated into my corporate security system. I pulled up the live feed from the security camera, mounted just outside the penthouse's front door. The high-definition footage showed Damon and Paige stepping off the elevator. They looked drained, soaked from the rain, and utterly miserable. Paige was lugging her heavy wedding dress in her arms, mascara streaked in dark lines down her face. Damon strode up to the sleek black door with fury written across every feature. He reached out and pressed his thumb against the biometric fingerprint scanner, fully expecting the door to glide open and receive him into his multi-million-dollar refuge. The scanner answered with a sharp, harsh beep. The ring of light around the pad did not shift to its usual welcoming green. It pulsed a bright, furious red instead. Access denied. Damon scowled and rubbed his thumb against his shirt, assuming the sensor was simply dirty. He pressed again. Another harsh beep. Another red flash. He switched to his index finger. Red. He punched his emergency backup code into the glowing keypad. The screen replied in bold white letters, "Security lockout." I sat in the rear of my town car, watching the feed with a cold and steady pulse. My son was only now grasping the full weight of what had happened. He was locked out of his home, locked away from his wealth, and cut off from the future he had assumed was his birthright. The real nightmare was only getting started. The rain was still hammering the city of Houston when my security team pushed the first alert to my secure tablet. Damon and his new bride had been shut out of the luxury penthouse in Midtown Houston entirely. With his corporate cards permanently deactivated and every bank account frozen solid, they had no destination. They were reduced to booking a cheap rideshare to a rundown motel just off the interstate. The contrast to the $5,000 a night estate they had been ejected from could not have been more severe. I pictured Paige sitting in that damp, low-rent room in a custom silk wedding gown, now destroyed by rain and grime. A person with any wisdom at all would have used that moment to examine what they had done and reach out to apologize. But Paige was not wise. She was arrogant, and she carried the particular brand of privilege that convinces a person they are simply incapable of truly losing. Rather than reflecting, she picked up her phone and decided to fight. By 2:00 in the morning, a video had appeared on her social media account. I sat in the still darkness of my study and watched it play. Paige was perched on the edge of the cheap motel bed. Her expensive makeup had been deliberately smeared to manufacture the look of a victim. She held the camera steady and let her eyes fill with practiced tears. Her voice broke at precisely the right moments as she built a narrative constructed entirely from lies. She told her millions of followers that her perfect wedding had been torn apart by a hostile and unstable mother-in-law. She deployed every piece of coded language that society has long used to criminalize black women. She claimed that my wife had been aggressive toward her from the very beginning, driven by resentment of her race and her privileged background. She looked into the lens and wept, alleging that Vivian had cornered and attacked her, forcing Paige to defend herself out of pure necessity. She presented herself as an innocent and fragile young bride who had narrowly escaped a violent family. It was a flawless performance of weaponized victimhood. Within an hour, the video had gone completely viral. The internet is always hungry for a tragedy, especially one built around a weeping young woman claiming she has been wronged. I watched the view count surge into the millions. The comment section transformed into an open sewer of hatred. Total strangers with no knowledge of our lives whatsoever began launching vicious racial attacks against my wife. They called Vivian a bitter old woman. They used degrading language suggesting she was consumed by jealousy over her beautiful young daughter-in-law. They said she belonged in a cage. They demanded that Paige press charges against the violent thugs who had destroyed her wedding. I did not allow anger to surface as I read those comments. Anger is a worthless emotion. It obscures your thinking and hands the advantage to your enemy. What descended over me instead was a deep, freezing calm. They were attacking a 74-year-old woman who had spent her life raising up communities and pouring her resources into charitable causes. The public did not care about any of that. They wanted the spectacle. Then I saw the one thing that extinguished the very last ember of fatherly love still burning anywhere inside me. Pinned to the top of the comment section beneath that poisonous video was a message from my son. Damon had used his verified account to leave a public statement for the entire world to read. He wrote that he stood fully behind his wife. He wrote that no one should ever be made to endure the kind of treatment Paige had suffered on her wedding day. I stared at those words for a long time. My son, the boy I had spent a lifetime building into a king, had publicly aligned himself with the woman who drew his mother's blood. He chose to amplify a racist lie rather than defend the woman who brought him into this world. He was an active participant in the public destruction of his own mother's character. In that precise moment, Damon ceased to exist to me. Any remaining thought of rehabilitation or future reconciliation was wiped from my mind permanently. He was no longer a son who had disappointed me. He was an enemy. What the millions of people watching that video had no way of knowing was what had actually ignited the confrontation. They did not know what took place inside the luxury bridal suite exactly 1 hour before the reception began. Vivian had gone up to the suite alone. She carried with her a velvet box containing a vintage sapphire brooch that had been in our family for decades. A gift intended to welcome Paige into the family and signal that whatever our differences, she was now one of us. When Vivian eased open the door to the bridal suite, she did not find a nervous bride making her final preparations. She found Paige seated at the expensive mahogany vanity, with 3 of her wealthy bridesmaids gathered around her. Spread across the surface of the mirror was a pile of white powder. Paige had a tightly rolled $100 bill pressed to her nostril, snorting cocaine minutes before she was supposed to walk down the aisle. Vivian stood motionless in the doorway. But the drugs were not even the most damaging thing she witnessed. Paige was laughing openly with her friends. She was boasting about the prenuptial agreement our corporate lawyers had required her to sign. Paige told her bridesmaids that she had quietly retained her own attorney to examine the document. He had found a significant loophole buried in the trust fund provisions. She only needed to stay married to my son for exactly 1 year. At the 12-month mark, she could trigger a divorce clause that would entitle her to half of the $50 million trust fund. She called Damon a stupid meal ticket and referred to our family as a collection of gullible fools starving for white validation. My wife absorbed every word. Vivian did not scream. She did not lose her composure. She walked into the room with a quiet authority and set the velvet box on the table. Paige froze and dropped the rolled bill the instant she registered that she had been caught. Vivian held her gaze and told Paige to wash her face, collect her belongings, and leave the estate at once. She promised that if Paige slipped out through the back quietly, we would handle the cancellation with discretion and keep her drug use entirely private. But Paige was riding cocaine and her own arrogance in equal measure. She believed herself untouchable. So instead of leaving, she repaired her makeup, arranged her smile, and descended to the grand ballroom to force the wedding forward. When Vivian approached her later on the dance floor to quietly insist that she end the charade, Paige panicked. With her enormous payday suddenly at risk of slipping away, she chose to strike first. She hit my wife in front of 400 witnesses to ignite chaos and confusion, hoping to seize control of the narrative exactly as she was now doing on social media. She was certain her plan was working. She believed the viral video would squeeze us into paying whatever she demanded to make the public relations disaster go away. She thought we were the kind of soft billionaires who would write any check to protect a corporate image. She had no idea that I had spent 40 years swimming alongside sharks, and I knew precisely how to open a vein in a predator and watch it drain. The morning sun finally broke through the thick wall of rain clouds, throwing pale light across our estate. Vivienne was resting in the master bedroom. I was settled at the heavy oak desk in my private office, methodically mapping the digital footprint of every shell company connected to Paige's family. The intercom on my desk gave a soft buzz. My head of security reported that a vehicle had just rolled up to the main gate. I cleared it through. 5 minutes later, my lead corporate attorney stepped into my office. He was a hard, humorless man who kept his feelings locked behind a wall of stone. But that morning, his face carried a tight, rigid tension I rarely saw on him. He crossed the room and set a thick stack of legal documents down in front of me. He told me that Paige and her bankrupt father hadn't wasted a single breath. They'd gone out and retained a sleazy, high-profile litigator, the kind of man who built his career on public smear campaigns. What was sitting on my desk was a formally drafted lawsuit. Paige was suing me and my wife for $10 million, alleging severe emotional distress, public humiliation, and false imprisonment on account of the venue doors being locked. The filing came with a demand for immediate settlement and a warning if we refused to pay. The viral video would only be the opening act of a massive media campaign designed to level my corporate empire. I looked down at the absurd stack of papers. A $10 million extortion attempt dressed up in civil litigation clothing. They believed they'd driven me into a corner. They believed the threat of public destruction would pry open my vault and send a fortune sliding into their hands. I reached out slowly and tapped my fingers against the thick stack. A cold, genuine smile crept across my face. They had taken the bait without a moment's hesitation. The lawsuit handed me the precise legal opening I needed to swing the vault door wide. Only what they'd find inside wasn't money. It was their own complete and total ruin. The meeting was set for $10,000 the following morning at my primary legal counsel's downtown offices. My corporate attorney, Mr. Drummond, was a man who carried the warmth of a great white shark and the precision of a military sniper. His offices occupied the 50th floor of a gleaming glass tower that I happened to own through a subsidiary holding company. The conference room was fully soundproofed, anchored by a massive mahogany table and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out across the sweeping Houston skyline. I sat alone at the head of the table in a high-backed leather chair. Vivian was safely at home, resting in our quiet garden. I had no intention of letting her breathe the same air as the people about to come through those heavy oak doors. This execution I would handle myself. At exactly 10:15, the glass doors swung open. They were 15 minutes late, a cheap, transparent power play, the kind meant to get under my skin. Paige and Damon marched in, flanked by a man who looked like he belonged hawking personal injury settlements on late-night television. He was their freshly hired litigator, flashy, pinstriped suit, far too much cologne, and the grin of someone who'd never once been genuinely outmatched. Paige looked nothing like the weeping, shattered victim she'd been performing as on social media just hours earlier. She had on a tailored designer dress, a luxury leather handbag on her arm, and she was projecting an air of absolute triumph. She was certain she had me cornered. She was certain her viral video and her $10 million lawsuit were the weapons that would bring me to my knees. Damon walked in right behind her eyes, dropping to the polished floor, same as he'd done at the wedding. He pulled out a chair for his wife and settled in beside her, refusing to lift his gaze and meet mine. He looked worn down and frightened, but he was still foolish enough to follow her lead. He still clung to the belief that being my only son would somehow shield him from total devastation. The sleazy litigator didn't bother with a proper introduction. He heaved a thick leather briefcase onto the mahogany table and leaned forward, knuckles pressed against the polished wood. He spoke in a loud, grating voice that bounced off the walls of that quiet room, filling the space, trying to own it. He told me his clients were prepared to make the entire public relations disaster disappear right here, right now. He claimed they had been profoundly traumatized by what had occurred at the wedding and the emotional damage my wife had allegedly inflicted on Paige. He announced that the $10 million lawsuit would be formally withdrawn and the viral video scrubbed from the internet if we simply agreed to their very reasonable terms. Those terms were not a payment schedule. Those terms were the immediate dissolution of Damon's trust fund. Paige crossed her legs and fixed me with a smile from across the table. Pure, undiluted greed flickered in her eyes. She demanded we unlock the $50 million trust fund that Damon was supposedly entitled to receive upon marriage. She broke down exactly how the money would be divided. $10 million would flow directly to her as a tax-free settlement for her suffering. The remaining $40 million would land in a joint account for her and Damon to build their new life far away from our toxic, abusive family. She actually used the word toxic. She sat there in a building I owned, demanding $50 million of my hard-earned money because she had assaulted my wife and played the victim on the internet. I didn't say a word. I didn't lean forward. I didn't flinch. I simply turned my eyes to Mr. Drummond, who sat perfectly motionless at my right hand. Men who hold real power don't need to raise their voices to win. We let the paperwork do the screaming. Drummond adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and lifted a single charcoal gray folder from his immaculate desk. He did not open his briefcase. He did not produce stacks of defense filings or countersuits. He only had that one thin folder. Mr. Drummond slid it slowly across the smooth mahogany surface until it came to rest directly in front of the flashy litigator. The whisper of paper against wood was the only sound in the room. Drummond spoke in a voice so measured and quiet that the opposing lawyer had to lean in just to catch it. He informed them calmly that they were operating under a massive and profoundly embarrassing delusion. He told Paige that she had married a man based on a fundamental misreading of how wealth is actually structured. The litigator flipped the folder open and started reading. Paige leaned over his shoulder, her smug expression beginning to falter as her eyes worked through the dense legal language. Mr. Drummond translated it into plain English, making certain every single word landed. He said that Damon did not possess a $50 million trust fund. Damon did not own 1 cent of the family wealth. The trust had been established decades ago as a fully discretionary generation-skipping trust. Drummond spelled out exactly what that meant. Damon was nothing more than a discretionary beneficiary. That meant he had zero legal standing to demand a single payout ever. Every dollar Damon had ever spent, every sports car he'd ever driven, every luxury apartment he'd ever called home, all of it had been granted purely at the discretion of the trustees. And the sole trustees of that vast account were myself and Vivian. We held every key to the kingdom. Damon was nothing more than a dependent who'd been permitted to sleep inside the castle walls. The law was absolute. Damon could not compel a payout. He could not borrow against the principal. He could not pledge the assets to any bank. And he most certainly could not hand any of it over to a greedy bride who believed she'd outsmarted a man who built an empire from concrete and steel. I watched the color drain completely from Damon's face. His breathing grew heavy and labored. He had spent his entire adult life boasting to friends and to his new wife about his massive trust fund. He had strutted through Houston high society, performing the role of a billionaire, when the truth was, he was nothing but a dependent surviving on an allowance that could be yanked away at any moment. He had sold Paige a fantasy, and now the invoice had arrived. Paige turned to look at Damon, her eyes wide and blazing. The grand illusion of her payday was fracturing in real time right in front of her. She grasped in that exact moment that the golden goose she believed she'd captured was in reality completely broke. The $50 million she had constructed her entire future around the money she had snorted drugs over and bragged about in the bridal suite was locked inside a vault she could never force open. She had torched her reputation and committed a felony for a man with zero financial power. But Paige was like a rat cornered with nowhere to run. She carried a dangerous brand of arrogance that simply would not bend to reality. The shock on her face twisted rapidly into a mask of pure venom. She slammed her hand down on the heavy wooden table and fixed her glare on Mr. Drummond. She let out a laugh, a harsh, grating sound that cut through the silence of the room. She told my attorney he was bluffing, and that she was not some uneducated girl who could be rattled by fancy corporate language. She swung her attention back to her litigator and demanded he explain the real law to us. Paige declared with full conviction that it didn't matter whether the trust was discretionary. She pointed out that she and Damon were legally married now. She invoked community property laws and marital asset division, carrying on as though she'd earned a law degree overnight. She insisted that because the trust had been established for Damon's benefit the moment they'd signed their marriage certificate, she became legally entitled to a share of its disbursements in order to maintain her marital standard of living. She threatened to drag the trust through a sprawling, ugly divorce settlement. She claimed she would compel a family court judge to mandate a massive payout based on the lifestyle she'd been promised. Her sleazy attorney nodded along, scrambling to recover his footing after being caught completely off guard. He had almost certainly taken this case on contingency, expecting a fast, multi-million-dollar settlement from a rattled family desperate to protect their public image. Now he was staring down the barrel of a prolonged, grinding legal war against a billionaire with bottomless resources. Still, he puffed out his chest and declared that no judge would look favorably upon a wealthy family sitting on piled assets while leaving a young newlywed couple with nothing particularly in the wake of a highly publicized physical altercation. They believed they'd discovered a loophole. They believed that by turning the family court system into a weapon, They could muscle me into compliance through public pressure and legal exhaustion. I glanced at my son, who was now sweating through his collar, his eyes locked on the charcoal gray folder, as though it were a loaded gun pointed at his chest. He finally grasped the true scale of the hole he'd dug for himself, but fear had him frozen solid. Paige, meanwhile, was still smirking, certain her community property argument was the winning move, the final checkmate against the old man. She thought she'd outmaneuvered me. I gave Mr. Drummond one slow, deliberate nod. The game was finished. It was time to spring the last trap and let the steel jaws slam shut around everything they thought they had. Mr. Drummond did not engage with their legal theories. He did not raise his voice or tell them their community property argument was wrong. He simply reached across the table and turned the heavy legal document to page 47. He pressed the tip of his expensive gold fountain pen twice against a specific paragraph highlighted in bold black ink. He looked directly into Paige's arrogant eyes and told her that community property law had no reach over a beneficiary who had just triggered the ironclad clause. Mr. Drummond didn't so much as flinch when Paige hurled her community property argument across the mahogany table. He didn't waste a breath arguing with a woman who clearly had far more arrogance than legal knowledge. He simply sat there with the unnerving stillness of a man holding every winning card in the deck. He had no need to shout. He let the silence stretch, allowing her hollow confidence to dangle in the cool, air-conditioned room right up until the moment he dismantled it entirely. Section 8 of the Family Trust Agreement was a provision I had personally demanded when my real estate empire first crossed the billion-dollar threshold. I came up in a hard world where money had a way of tearing families to pieces. I had watched greed turn brothers into bitter enemies and children into ungrateful parasites. Vivian and I had made each other a promise that the wealth we'd built from scratch, working multiple jobs and surrendering our youth to do it, would never become the instrument of our own undoing. We directed our legal team to embed a poison pill into the very bedrock of the trust. It was a fail-safe mechanism engineered to sever the financial artery completely the moment a beneficiary demonstrated they were unworthy of our legacy. Mr. Drummond smoothed the heavy parchment with both hands. He looked directly at Paige's sleazy litigator and told him to pay very close attention to the precise language on page 47. Drummond began reading aloud, his measured voice carrying off the glass walls of the high-rise boardroom. He read Section 8, the Morality Clause. The legal language was absolute and it offered no mercy. It stated that any physical or psychological harm inflicted upon the grantors, meaning myself and Vivian, by a beneficiary or their legally wedded spouse would result in immediate and permanent disinheritance. Drummond didn't stop there. He continued working through each precise stipulation of the clause, making certain they understood the full gravity of what they were hearing. The document required that the moment an act of aggression was placed on record, the beneficiary would be stripped entirely of all current and future access to the trust's assets. There was no grace period. There was no mandatory arbitration process to establish intent. There was no trustee vote required before the penalty took effect. The disinheritance triggered itself automatically the instant Paige raised her hand and struck my wife in front of 400 witnesses. The silence that settled over the boardroom was so complete, you could pick out the faint hum of the ventilation system overhead. The flashy litigator who had strutted into my building demanding $10 million just minutes earlier was now rendered completely mute. He stared at the charcoal gray folder as though it had transformed into something venomous sitting in front of him. He understood exactly what that clause meant. Any lawyer worth the title knows that a generation-skipping discretionary trust reinforced by a strict morality clause is virtually bulletproof. Paige, however, was not a lawyer. She was a spoiled, calculating woman who had spent her whole life bending people to her will. She looked back and forth between Mr. Drummond and her own attorney, waiting for someone to push back. When her attorney held his silence, she let out a loud, disbelieving scoff. She leaned across the table and told Mr. Drummond that a piece of paper couldn't just magically erase her husband's money. She circled back to her flawed conviction that marital rights protected her. She told my lawyer with full arrogance that her father would keep this tangled up in family court for the next 10 years, if that's what it took. Mr. Drummond adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and regarded her with a blend of pity and absolute contempt. He calmly explained that she could not tie up assets that no longer existed. He informed her that as of midnight on the evening of the wedding, every account connected to Damon had been legally dissolved and absorbed back into the primary corporate holding company. Drummond noted that the official medical report from Houston Methodist Hospital documenting the felony assault on Vivian had already been formally filed and attached to the trust dissolution papers. The legal requirements of the morality clause had been satisfied without a single flaw. The litigator seated beside Paige began quietly closing his leather briefcase. He had walked into this room expecting a swift, easy payday from an old man trying to sidestep a scandal. Now he understood he had stepped into a legal slaughterhouse. He knew that contesting a morality clause backed by a documented emergency room visit and 400 eyewitnesses was a battle no one could win. Beyond that, he had just realized that the wealthy young couple he was representing had absolutely no money to cover his steep hourly fees. He snapped the brass locks on his briefcase shut and eased his chair back from the table, already preparing to abandon a ship, taking on water fast. Paige watched her attorney pulling away, and for the first time genuine panic began clawing its way up her throat. The smug, triumphant expression she'd worn since the moment she walked through my doors dissolved completely. Her perfectly manicured hands started to tremble. She turned her head slowly and looked at Damon. My son sat utterly motionless in his high-backed leather chair. The crushing reality of his circumstances was finally bearing down on him with its full weight. For 28 years, Damon had lived cocooned inside a protective bubble of limitless wealth. He had never applied for a mortgage. He had never lost sleep over a credit card bill. He had never held a real job in his life. His entire sense of self was built on the fact that he was the golden heir to my vast real estate empire. He wore bespoke suits, drove imported Italian sports cars, and threw thousands of dollars at expensive champagne just to look impressive in front of shallow friends. But beneath all the fine clothes and the hollow arrogance, Damon was nothing. He possessed no real-world skills to fall back on. He had no professional network beyond the people who were simply using him to access my money. He was nothing more than a weak, hollow boy who had stood by and watched his mother bleed because he lacked the spine to stand up to his spoiled bride. And now, because of that precise cowardice, he had forfeited the one thing that made him worth anything to the woman sitting beside him. I sat at the head of the table and watched my son come apart. His chest heaved in shallow, ragged bursts, and fat beads of sweat gathered on his forehead. He looked down the length of the table at me, his eyes stretched wide with naked terror. His mouth fell open, but nothing came out. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to get down on his knees and beg for another chance. He wanted to tell me it had all been one terrible mistake, that he truly loved his mother. But I gave him nothing to hold on to. I didn't glare at him with fury. I didn't let a triumphant smile cross my face at the sight of his ruin. I simply looked at him the way you look at a complete stranger passing you on the street, cold, flat, indifferent. Paige was watching him too. I could see the gears grinding frantically inside her head as she processed the catastrophic collapse of her reality. She had spent months plotting behind our backs, working every angle. She had endured what she privately considered a degrading relationship with a black man purely to lock in a luxurious financial future. She had snorted cocaine in the bridal suite and boasted to her friends about the millions she intended to extract from our supposedly gullible family. She had struck an elderly woman in public and launched a viral smear campaign online, all of it designed to force my hand and secure her payout. And every last bit of it had amounted to absolutely nothing. She had not married a billionaire heir. She had married a broke, unemployed man with no housing, no credit cards, and no future to speak of. She had legally bound herself to a massive liability. The $50 million payday she had built her dreams around was gone for good, sealed behind an impenetrable legal wall she would never breach. The realization landed on her like a physical blow to the gut. The color drained from her face, making the heavy makeup around her eyes look garish and wrong. The grand illusion of her high society superiority shattered right there inside my corporate boardroom. She was a woman already drowning in debt from a bankrupt family, and she had just legally chained herself to a man who couldn't even afford to buy her the cheapest cup of coffee. The silence in the room stretched, growing thick and suffocating. Paige's breathing turned shallow and erratic. She rose slowly from her chair, her designer dress rustling conspicuously in the quiet. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Mr. Drummond or at her attorney, who was already halfway out the door. She turned her whole body toward my son. The shift was immediate and chilling to watch. The fragile, wounded woman who had posted a tearful video online just hours earlier claiming she loved her husband and was fighting to protect their sacred marriage vanished completely. The victim mask dropped away, and what it revealed underneath was a vicious, calculating predator. Every ounce of anger, every stab of public humiliation, every crushing wave of disappointment she was carrying locked instantly onto Damon. She looked down at him, sweating, trembling in his chair, and her eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. She understood now that he had known all along about the discretionary nature of the trust. She understood that he had lied to her about the degree of control he had over that money, just to get her to marry him. He had performed the role of a powerful billionaire, but he was nothing more than an obedient lapdog who had just been kicked out of the house. Paige's fists clenched at her sides until her knuckles went white. She leaned down and gripped both armrests of his chair, caging him in. Her face hovered just inches from Damon's sweat-drenched forehead. The boardroom held its breath, waiting for the inevitable detonation. The trap I had laid had executed itself perfectly. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or lift a single finger to bring them down. I simply took away the money and let their own poisonous greed do the rest, eating through them from the inside. Paige sucked in a long, ragged breath, coiling herself to unleash everything she had on the man she had pledged to love just 48 hours before. Then she turned and stormed out of the boardroom, leaving her flashy litigator standing there alone. She didn't wait for Damon. She drove straight for the elevator designer, heels hammering the marble floor with every furious step. Damon stumbled after her like a dog that had lost its owner. He was operating on pure autopilot, completely hollowed out. The $50 million he had treated as his birthright was gone permanently. When they reached the ground floor, the full weight of their situation crashed into them. They had no car waiting. Damon's black corporate Visa Infinite card was dead. Paige had to dig out her own nearly maxed-out personal card to book a cheap rideshare. They stood on the bustling sidewalk in the thick Houston heat, waiting for a dented sedan to pull up to the curb. It was a humiliating plunge for two people who had been flying exclusively on private jets just a week before. Paige sat in the back seat, biting her nails, as her mind clawed desperately for any exit from the hole she'd buried herself in. She told the driver to head to the Westwood Country Club. It was the oldest and most exclusive private club in the city, the sort of place where her parents, Gerard and Loretta, spent every afternoon nursing expensive gin and making the rounds with other bankrupt aristocrats. Paige was convinced her family name could still save her. She believed her father would simply produce a large check, smooth everything over, and restore the comfortable life she felt entitled to. She dragged Damon along, not out of any love or loyalty, but because he was the only bargaining chip she had left. The drive took 45 minutes. The silence in the back of that car was dense and suffocating. Damon stared out the window, watching the city he used to feel he owned slide past him. He was a prince, newly exiled from his own kingdom. Paige didn't look at him once. She was furiously typing on her phone, seemingly unable to acknowledge that she was the one who had ignited this entire disaster by putting her hands on my wife in front of a room full of witnesses. When the rideshare finally rolled up to the grand iron gates of the Westwood Country Club, the guard in the booth hesitated. He was accustomed to imported luxury vehicles gliding through not a dinged-up sedan. Paige had to lean out the window and shout her maiden name at him before he finally raised the gate. The club itself was a sweeping colonial estate set against immaculate golf fairways and old oak trees hung with Spanish moss, a towering monument to old Southern wealth and white exclusivity. It was also the kind of place where people who looked like me and Damon had traditionally only been permitted to enter through the service entrance, carrying trays. Damon had always felt a deep, gnawing discomfort here. But he had swallowed that feeling again and again because he so desperately wanted to belong in Paige's world. Now climbing those pristine white clubhouse steps in a wrinkled suit, he looked exactly like the outsider they had always quietly regarded him as. Paige blew through the heavy mahogany doors without a glance at the greeting staff, making a straight line for the private dining terrace. Damon trailed behind, with his head down, hollowed by shame. Out on the terrace, bright afternoon sun spilled across the green expanse of the golf course. Gerard and Loretta were at their usual corner table beneath a wide canvas umbrella, drinking expensive wine and laughing freely with another wealthy white couple. When Gerard caught sight of his daughter cutting across the terrace toward him, his practiced cordial smile flickered. He noticed her disheveled state. He saw the raw panic burning behind her eyes. Paige had no patience for pleasantries. She walked straight up to the table, dragged over an empty chair, and dropped into it, breathing hard. She told her parents they needed to speak privately right now. Gerard excused himself from his guests, and Loretta fell in step behind them as they retreated to a quiet lounge tucked deep inside the clubhouse. Damon hovered by the doorway, out of place and powerless in equal measure. Paige didn't waste a breath. She looked at her father and laid out everything that had just taken place inside Mr. Drummond's office. She explained that the $50 million trust fund was a complete fiction. She walked them through the morality clause and how the medical report from the hospital had given me the clean legal right to disinherit Damon without challenge. She admitted that Damon had been completely cut off from the family fortune and that the two of them were currently locked out of their luxury penthouse with nothing to their name. Loretta's hand flew to her pearl necklace, clutching it so hard the string looked ready to give. She let out a sharp gasp, her eyes snapping toward Damon with an expression of pure, undisguised horror. Gerard stood completely still, while the color slowly bled out of his face as the weight of his daughter's words settled over him. He had given his eager blessing to this marriage because he'd believed Damon was the golden key to rescuing his own crumbling business empire. Gerard was quietly drowning in $15 million of toxic corporate debt and had been counting on his new billionaire in-laws to quietly absorb the damage and spare him the indignity of a very public bankruptcy. He had tolerated our family and kept a smile on his face around my wife, because he believed we were his financial lifeline. Now he was staring at a son-in-law who was poorer than the waiters circling the terrace outside with drink trays. The heavy silence inside that private room was finally broken by Gerard's cold, bitter laughter. It wasn't the sound of amusement. It was the ugly, hollow sound of an arrogant man who had just realized he'd been thoroughly outplayed by someone he'd always considered beneath him. Gerard turned his gaze slowly toward Damon. The carefully maintained mask of the progressive, tolerant white liberal evaporated on the spot. No more false courtesy. No more performance of treating Damon as an equal. Gerard looked at my son with absolute seething disgust. He closed the distance between them, his face deepening to a dark shade of crimson. "You mean to tell me," Gerard hissed, venom soaking every word, "that you are absolutely nothing? You came through my home drinking my expensive scotch, asking permission to marry my daughter, and you don't even own the suit on your back." Damon opened his mouth to respond, but his voice collapsed in his throat. He stumbled over his words, trying to explain that he hadn't understood the discretionary clause, that he had genuinely believed the money would eventually come under his control. But Gerard had no interest in hearing a stammering apology. Loretta stepped forward, her face contorted into an ugly, contemptuous sneer. She looked Damon up and down the way you'd look at something rotting that had drifted into your house uninvited. "We opened our family to you," she snapped, her voice shaking with fury. "We compromised our social standing to let a boy like you marry our daughter because you guaranteed her a life of luxury, and now you expect us to come behind you and clean up this mess. You are absolutely pathetic." The racial slurs came next. They didn't raise their voices, they didn't need the other club members to hear. They kept it quiet, delivering each word with a casual, deliberate cruelty that made the impact far worse than shouting would have been. Gerard used words that methodically stripped away every shred of Damon's dignity, making clear exactly what this old money family had always privately thought of a black man the moment there was no longer a massive bank account attached to him. Damon stood there and absorbed every insult, every slur, every degrading remark, without uttering a single word in his own defense. He understood in that agonizing moment that Paige's family had never loved him. They had never even liked him. They had simply endured his presence because it came packaged with my black corporate Visa Infinite card. The instant that card stopped working, his humanity was revoked entirely. It was a brutal and devastating awakening for a young man who had spent his whole life attempting to purchase the respect of people who secretly despised him. Paige did not defend her husband. She didn't tell her father to stop. She sat in her chair, crying hollow, self-pitying tears, feeling sorry for no one but herself. Gerard swung his attention back to his daughter, his eyes cool and calculating. He told Paige to wipe her face and stop behaving like a child. He instructed her to take off her diamond wedding ring immediately. "You are not going to stay married to this useless street rat," Gerard commanded, leveling a rigid finger at Damon. "You are going to file for divorce first thing tomorrow morning, but we are not walking away from this empty-handed. Your arrogant father-in-law thinks he can play games with our family. He thinks he can humiliate us in front of this entire city, lock you out of a venue, and hide his money behind a piece of paper. He has no idea who he is dealing with." Gerard began to pace the floor of the private lounge, his posture gradually swelling back with arrogant confidence. He promised his daughter that he would personally bankroll the most vicious corporate divorce attorneys in the entire state of Texas. He vowed to fire off an endless barrage of discovery motions, subpoena every financial record my company had ever produced, and drag my corporate name through the mud at every opportunity. He told Paige they would sue me for concealing marital assets for emotional distress and for anything else his expensive lawyers could conjure up on a billing sheet. He swore he would bleed me dry through relentless litigation until I was cornered into offering a massive multi-million-dollar settlement just to end the public relations bleeding. Then he turned to Damon one final time and told him to get out of the country club before he had security remove him by the back of his neck. Damon turned and walked out without a word, leaving his wife sitting there taking nothing with him but his shattered dignity. He was completely broken. While my son was being shown the door and Gerard was busy engineering his grand legal offensive, I was sitting in my private office above the Houston skyline, calm and unhurried. I had anticipated Gerard's reaction down to the letter. I knew that a desperate, arrogant man always chooses to charge rather than retreat. I knew he would reach for his old money connections and threaten to dismantle my business through the courts. What Gerard did not know was that his old money was already completely gone. I poured myself a cup of dark black coffee and settled into my chair behind the heavy oak desk. My secure corporate iPad rested on the polished surface. The screen flared to life with a high-priority notification from my shadow hedge fund manager. I picked up the device and read the single line of text glowing on the screen. The trap had been primed to perfection. It was time to pull the secondary trigger and show Gerard exactly who owned his world. Gerard was a man who genuinely believed his social standing and his skin color made him untouchable. After ejecting my son from the club, he'd gone back to his shaded table with his daughter. He ordered another glass of expensive gin and told Paige to dry her eyes. He assured her the nightmare was behind them and that he would personally secure her financial future. He promised her the most ruthless corporate divorce attorneys in the state to tear my family to pieces. To demonstrate his power, Gerard drew his expensive smartphone from his jacket pocket and pulled up his private banking application. His plan was to wire $500,000 directly into Paige's personal checking account. It was intended as a swift down payment seed money for a luxury condominium and a legal retainer. He punched the amount into the screen with full, unshaken confidence and hit the button to execute the transfer. He lifted his glass and waited for the confirmation. Instead, a red error message blazed across the screen. It read simply, "Insufficient funds and account frozen." Gerard frowned, treating it as nothing more than a minor technical glitch. Men of his supposed standing don't receive error messages. He went straight to his phone and dialed the direct line to his personal wealth manager at the regional bank in Savannah. He fully expected the man to answer on the first ring with groveling apologies and an immediate resolution. But the banker's voice on the other end was not apologetic. It was shaking. The manager told Gerard that the failed transfer was not a technical error. He explained that all corporate accounts, personal checking accounts, and emergency lines of credit tied to the family name had been legally frozen under a direct court order. A primary creditor holding the debt on Gerard's failing logistics company had just executed an emergency asset freeze citing a critical breach of financial covenants. The blood drained completely out of Gerard's face. His hand trembled so badly, he dropped his crystal glass onto the patio floor where it shattered. He ended the call without a word, pushed back from the table, and left his daughter sitting there alone in bewilderment. He bolted out of the country club, threw himself into his luxury car, and drove recklessly toward his corporate headquarters. While Gerard was hurtling down the highway in a blind panic, I was sitting comfortably in my quiet office above the Houston skyline, pouring a second cup of dark coffee unhurried. I had been waiting patiently for this precise moment for 3 long months. When Damon first brought Paige to our estate and announced their engagement with such pride, something deep in my instincts told me immediately that something was very wrong with her family. I did not smile and nod like a foolish old man hungry for validation. Instead, I retained the most thorough and relentless private investigator in the state of Texas. I paid him a substantial premium to go well beyond public records and dig deep into the supposedly pristine background of Paige's old money family. He came back a week later carrying a trove of pathetic secrets. What he uncovered was equal parts darkly comic and extraordinarily useful for the long-term plan I was quietly assembling. The old money prestige that Gerard and Loretta paraded around at their country club dinners was nothing more than a carefully polished mirage. Their sprawling ancestral estate in Savannah was mortgaged to the absolute ceiling, but Gerard's true vulnerability ran deeper than the property. His regional logistics and trucking company had been quietly hemorrhaging cash for the past 5 years. Gerard was an arrogant man who refused to move with the times. He still ran his dispatch operations off outdated paper ledgers and wouldn't invest $1 in modernizing his decaying fleet of delivery trucks. To paper over his massive operating losses while keeping up the trappings of his high society life, he had taken out punishing loans from various secondary banks. He had accumulated exactly $15 million in high-interest, short-term corporate debt. He was a man standing on a trapdoor with a thick rope around his neck waiting for someone to pull the lever. I decided I would be the one with my hand on that lever. I said nothing to Damon about what I'd discovered. My son was too fragile and would have unraveled the entire plan. Instead, I picked up the phone to my shadow wealth manager and delivered a very specific set of instructions. We established a proxy hedge fund, registered in Delaware, with zero public connection to my name or my real estate holdings. Using that ghost entity, my manager moved aggressively on the regional banks carrying Gerard's toxic debt. Those banks were desperate to shed the failing paper from their books before the company slid into official bankruptcy. They sold the debt to my proxy fund for pennies on the dollar, never once suspecting who the actual buyer was. Over 3 quiet weeks, I methodically acquired total and absolute command over every corner of Gerard's financial existence. By the time Paige slipped on her white dress and walked down the aisle, I was already the undisputed master of her family's fate. I had become their largest and most dangerous creditor. Gerard blew through the heavy glass doors of his corporate headquarters, completely winded. The building itself was aging and poorly kept, a fitting physical reflection of his failing stewardship. He charged straight into the executive boardroom, where his chief financial officer was already seated amid towering stacks of financial documents, looking utterly defeated. The officer raised pale, terrified eyes toward Gerard. He explained that an unknown Delaware hedge fund had just declared a full default on all their consolidated loans. The fund had legally frozen their operating accounts and was moving to seize the company's physical assets. He told Gerard they had effectively had the oxygen cut off. The company could no longer meet payroll. They couldn't purchase fuel for the delivery trucks. They couldn't even cover the mortgage payment on the Savannah family estate. Gerard was absolutely incensed. He had leaned on his skin color and his privilege his entire life to bully people into bending. He genuinely believed he could strong-arm any corporate entity over a phone line. He demanded the direct contact number for the hedge fund manager listed on the legal injunction. He ordered his financial officer to dial it and put the call on speakerphone right there in the middle of the boardroom. Gerard straightened his expensive tie and cleared his throat. He fully intended to deploy his country club charm and empty assurances to negotiate a grace period. He honestly believed he could bluff his way out of a $15 million crisis with a polished smile and a handful of arrogant threats. The phone rang twice before the line opened, but the call did not connect to a busy corporate office in Delaware. It routed directly to the secure smartphone sitting on my heavy oak desk in Houston. I picked up the device and listened to the ragged, panicked breathing filling the speaker. Gerard announced his name with manufactured authority and demanded to know exactly who he was addressing. He ordered his corporate accounts unfrozen on the spot, hurling threats of massive retaliatory lawsuits and invoking powerful political connections in the state government. He bellowed that they had no right to freeze his assets without a formal hearing. I let him rant and rail for a full, uninterrupted minute. I let him burn through every ounce of his hollow authority and run himself out of breath. The silence that followed on the secure line became heavy and suffocating. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth and deep, entirely stripped of emotion. I asked him one very simple question. I asked Gerard whether the expensive drinks at the Westwood Country Club had been refreshing. I asked him whether he still felt comfortable hurling racial slurs at a black man now that his bank accounts had gone dark. The silence that engulfed his boardroom was absolute. I could practically feel his heart stop through the phone. Gerard recognized my voice immediately. The arrogant man who had stood in that country club less than an hour ago, swearing to dismantle my family, was now frozen solid by the terrifying realization of his own total vulnerability. Gerard began to stammer. His mind could not absorb the catastrophic reality pressing in on him from every direction. He demanded to know how this was even possible. He accused me of some kind of illegal scheme against his family. I told him plainly that there were no schemes. I explained that while he was busy performing the role of a billionaire aristocrat, I was quietly and legally purchasing his entire reality out from under him. I informed him that the Delaware hedge fund carried no real existence of its own, and that I personally held every single piece of toxic debt attached to his failing name. I told him I owned the loans on his rotting trucks. I owned the mortgage on his corporate headquarters. And most importantly, I held the deed to his beloved ancestral estate in Savannah. That realization broke him completely. His progressive veneer, his aristocratic pride, his sense of racial superiority, all of it crumbled into dust in an instant. Within seconds, he was entirely at the mercy of the very man he had always secretly despised. Gerard began to beg. His voice cracked and whimpered like a beaten dog. He pleaded for a private sit-down. He asked for the opportunity to discuss a sensible payment arrangement, like civilized men. I refused without hesitation. I told Gerard that civilized men do not strike elderly women across the face, and they most certainly do not use degrading language against my son inside a country club. I told him he had forfeited any right to dignity the moment he permitted his daughter to disrespect my wife. I did not raise my voice as I delivered the final blow. I informed Gerard that the original loan agreements he had carelessly signed contained a strict financial health clause, and because his company was now officially insolvent, I held the absolute legal right to call in the full $15 million debt without delay. I issued a formal emergency margin call right there on the open phone line. I gave Gerard exactly 48 hours to wire $15 million in cash directly into my holding account. I promised him that if the full amount was not transferred by that deadline, I would execute a hostile corporate takeover without a moment's hesitation. I swore I would seize his logistics company, liquidate every asset he possessed, and foreclose on the Savannah estate, leaving his entire arrogant family without a roof over their heads. I ended the call and left Gerard sealed inside a silent room with his absolute destruction. The morning sun threw long, heavy shadows across the polished hardwood floor of my executive office. I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the vast, sprawling city of Houston. The city was a machine of ceaseless motion, and I owned a meaningful share of the gears keeping it in motion. My secure phone rested quietly at the center of my desk. Exactly 12 hours had elapsed since I issued the $15 million margin call that legally paralyzed every financial artery belonging to my new in-laws. I knew Gerard would not hold out for the full 48 hours. Men who have spent their entire lives performing power are always the first to shatter when genuine power is pressed against their throats. Right on cue, the intercom on my desk sounded with a soft chime. My executive assistant informed me that a man was standing in the lobby insisting on seeing me. He was visibly agitated, she noted, and was refusing to leave until he had spoken with the chairman personally. I told her to send him up, but instructed her to leave him standing in the elevator hall for exactly 20 minutes before opening the glass doors to my private suite. I wanted the cold weight of his circumstances to settle all the way into his bones. I wanted him to stand there staring at the expensive modern art and the silent marble walls of my empire, and understand that he was nothing more than a beggar at the gate. When the glass doors finally swung open, Gerard practically stumbled into my office. The change in him was staggering. The arrogant white aristocrat who had stood in the country club not even a day ago spitting racial slurs and vowing to erase my legacy was completely gone. The man standing before me looked like he had aged a decade overnight. His expensive tailored suit was crumpled and damp with perspiration. His tie hung loose, the top collar button torn open. His complexion had gone ashen, slicked with a thick sheen of anxious sweat. His hands trembled as he clutched a leather briefcase against his chest, like it was body armor. He halted a few feet from my desk, breathing in ragged pulls. His eyes swept the vast room, absorbing the sheer scale of the empire he had been foolish enough to cross. I did not invite him to sit. I did not offer him water. I simply stood behind my desk, hands folded, and waited for him to begin. Gerard swallowed hard and tried to pull himself upright, grasping for whatever thin remnant of old money dignity he could still summon. He parted his lips, but the booming, imperious voice that once held court among his country club circle had vanished entirely. In its place came a pathetic, quivering whisper. He addressed me by my first name, a transparent attempt to manufacture some sense of equal footing that did not exist in the slightest. He told me there had been a terrible misunderstanding between our families. He pointed to the pressures of the wedding day and the emotional weight of the ceremony as the cause of the cruel words he had directed at my son. He even attempted a smile, a sickly, desperate grimace that only made him look more wretched. He stepped closer and pressed both palms flat against the surface of my desk. He appealed to me to be reasonable. He explained that his logistics company kept hundreds of people employed, and that calling in the $15 million loan at once would drive him into total liquidation. He brought up his ancestral home in Savannah, the estate that had passed through 4 generations of his family. He told me that if the bank moved to foreclose on that property, his wife would suffer a breakdown, and his standing in society would be shattered beyond repair. He implored me, man to man, to extend the grace period on the loan. He pledged to repay every last cent at maximum interest if I simply allowed him 6 months to restructure his deteriorating business. I let him talk. I let him pour his desperate excuses and hollow promises all across my desk. I watched him shed every last pretense of aristocratic superiority to save his own skin. When he finally exhausted his words, he stood there breathless, waiting for me to extend the mercy he had so ruthlessly withheld from my family. I did not raise my voice. I did not betray a single trace of anger or vindictive satisfaction. The most terrifying thing a powerful man can do is show no emotion at all. I held Gerard's gaze and told him that his logistics company was a rotting corpse, and his family legacy nothing more than an illusion propped up by debt. I told him that $15 million was what my holding company generates inside a single fiscal quarter. The money was meaningless to me, but I knew it was the only oxygen keeping him breathing. I informed him that the debt would not be forgiven. There would be no 6-month extension. However, I told him I was prepared to halt the immediate liquidation of his company and suspend the foreclosure on his Savannah estate under one very specific and non-negotiable condition. Gerard's eyes flared open with a desperate flicker of hope. He nodded rapidly, declaring he would agree to absolutely anything. He offered to sign over company shares or hand me a seat on his board of directors. He was entirely willing to sell his soul to preserve his hollow way of life. I shook my head slowly. I told him I had no interest in his failing company, and I certainly had no desire to share a room with his racist associates. I told him the price of his financial survival was his daughter. Gerard went rigid, the color draining from his face all over again. I laid out the terms of the arrangement in cold, precise language. I told him that within the next 24 hours, Paige would sit down in front of a high-definition camera. She would record a new video and post it to every social media platform she controlled. In that video, she would publicly confess that her earlier claims were fabricated from beginning to end. She would admit to the entire world that she snorted cocaine in the bridal suite, that she had married my son purely to exploit his supposed trust fund, and that she was the one who had violently attacked my 74-year-old wife without provocation. But the public confession was only the first half of the ultimatum. I reached into my desk drawer and drew out a thick stack of legal documents my corporate attorneys had drafted that very morning. I set the heavy papers down on the desk with a solid thud. I told Gerard that once Paige had posted the video, she would sign every page of those documents. It was a comprehensive legal annulment and a total waiver of marital rights. The paperwork stated that Paige acknowledged the marriage had been entered into under fraudulent pretenses. It stripped her of any legal claim to spousal support, alimony, or any share of assets whatsoever. She would exit the marriage with precisely what she had brought into it, which was nothing at all. I looked Gerard up and down, studying the profound moral cowardice concealed beneath his expensive suit. I told him that if Paige executed this public confession and signed the annulment without a single modification, I would restructure his $15 million corporate debt into a manageable 10-year payment plan. He would keep his company. He would keep his precious mansion. But if she refused, or if he attempted to negotiate so much as a single comma on those legal papers, I would press the button and erase his entire bloodline from the financial map before sundown. The choice was devastatingly simple and brutally cruel. Gerard had to decide between his own financial survival and his daughter's public destruction. If he compelled her to confess, Paige would face serious legal consequences and complete social exile. Her reputation would be permanently obliterated. But if he shielded her, he would forfeit his wealth, his standing, and his home. I watched that internal battle play out across his sweat-drenched face. It lasted exactly 10 seconds. Old money greed is a cancer that consumes loyalty whole. Gerard did not argue. He did not attempt to defend his daughter or safeguard her future. He simply extended a trembling hand and drew the thick stack of annulment papers toward his chest. He looked up at me with hollow, defeated eyes and promised that the video would be posted by noon and the signed documents delivered to my lawyer before the day was out. He turned and practically fled my office, clutching the legal papers like a lifeline. I watched him lurch into the elevator, a broken, diminished man rushing off to turn his own family into a battlefield. He was about to walk into that cheap motel room and force his spoiled daughter to swallow her own poison. The enemy was no longer fighting me. They were now tearing at each other for scraps of survival. I settled back into my high-backed leather chair and drew a slow, deep breath. The corporate execution had been carried out without a flaw. I packed up my briefcase and instructed my assistant to clear my afternoon schedule. I wanted to go home to my wife. I wanted to sit in my quiet garden and drink lemonade, knowing the cancer had been fully cut from our lives. My driver returned me to the secure gated estate in River Oaks. The afternoon was warm and still. Vivian was on the back patio with a book in her lap. Her cheek remained bandaged, but the strain had melted entirely from her face. We sat together in easy silence, listening to the birds and watching the sun ease toward the horizon. We believed the worst of it was behind us. We assumed the legal mechanisms I had set in motion were simply running their course. But just as the sky deepened to a rich shade of orange, the heavy iron gates at the front of the estate buzzed loudly. My head of security appeared on this patio, his expression drawn tight. He told me that law enforcement had arrived at the perimeter. I stood and straightened my suit jacket. My first assumption was that Gerard had done something spectacularly foolish, called the police to report a financial crime, perhaps, or attempted to frame the whole thing as extortion. I walked at a measured pace through the house to the front entrance, fully expecting to dismiss a bewildered patrol officer in under 2 minutes. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. On my porch stood 2 serious-looking plainclothes detectives' official leather badges clipped to their belts. Their unmarked vehicle sat idling in my circular driveway. What you are about to hear is the moment when everything I had quietly built, every move, every sacrifice, every silent calculation, was finally put to the ultimate test. Before we get there, tell me this: if you discovered that someone close to you had been working against you from the very beginning, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the truth do its own damage? I looked at the lead detective and asked him what I could do for the Houston Police Department that evening. The detective did not smile. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of official court paper. He held my gaze and stated that he was serving an active felony arrest warrant. My pulse ticked up a fraction, but my expression did not move. I asked what the charges were. The detective read from the document felony elder abuse and filing a false police report. But as he unfolded the page and extended it toward me, I understood with complete clarity the brilliant thing that was actually unfolding. The warrant was not for me. It was not for my son. The police had come to my home looking for the bride. The evening air had turned cool, but the tension gathered on my front porch was dense and suffocating. I studied the lead detective standing before me, a tall man with silver-streaked hair and the worn expression of someone who had seen too much. His partner was younger, holding a small leather notebook at his side. The lead detective told me he was not there to place me under arrest, but that he carried a legal obligation to investigate a very serious formal complaint that had just been submitted. He explained that my daughter-in-law Paige had walked into a police precinct just 3 hours ago. She had sworn under oath and filed a formal report alleging that I had dispatched armed men to intimidate her and her family. Paige was in her own way a remarkable creature of pure delusion. She had come to understand that her viral social media video had not been enough to break me. She saw that her father was crumbling and that she remained legally bound to a man with nothing. So she chose to escalate her victimhood. She reached for the oldest and most poisonous tool in the American playbook. She decided to weaponize law enforcement against a wealthy black man. She believed her tears and her fragile image would automatically cast her as the innocent party in the eyes of the law. She imagined the police would splinter my doors, pull me out in handcuffs, and pressure me into settling her massive lawsuit simply to sidestep a criminal trial. I did not perform offense. I did not raise my voice or level accusations of racism at the detectives. When you possess the absolute truth, there is no need for defensiveness. I simply stepped back and swung the heavy mahogany front door open wider. I invited both detectives inside. I told them the evening chill was settling in, and that it would be far more comfortable to discuss these serious allegations over a fresh cup of coffee. The younger detective appeared caught off guard by my composure, but the older one gave a quiet nod and crossed the threshold. I led them through the grand foyer of my estate, their heavy boots leaving soft echoes against the polished marble floors. I guided them into my private study, a large room walled with floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves, carrying the scent of aged paper and fine leather. I directed them to the comfortable leather sofa set opposite my desk. Then I crossed to a small silver serving tray on the side table and filled 3 cups from a thermal carafe of dark roasted coffee. I handed one to each detective and settled into my high-backed chair. I took a measured sip and asked them to walk me through precisely what my daughter-in-law had claimed. The older detective retrieved a folded document from his jacket pocket, a copy of her sworn affidavit. He read it aloud. Paige claimed that shortly after being removed from the country club, she and Damon had returned to their cheap motel. She alleged that two large, unidentified men had pounded on their motel door, claiming to represent me. She stated that these men were armed and had threatened to inflict serious physical harm if she did not immediately abandon her $10 million lawsuit. On top of that, she doubled down on her original lie. She swore under penalty of perjury that Vivian had brutally attacked her in the bridal suite and that her actions in the ballroom were nothing more than self-defense against a violent elderly woman. It was a shrewdly assembled fabrication designed to provoke an immediate and forceful police response. She cast herself as a hostage and me as a mob boss. The younger detective kept his eyes on my face, watching for a crack, waiting for panic or an explosive denial. I set my coffee cup down on the wooden coaster on my desk. I leaned back slowly and released a quiet, genuine sigh. I told the detectives it was a deep tragedy when the legal system became a weapon in the hands of someone desperate to bury their own criminal conduct. I opened the top drawer of my desk and drew out a small, sleek, black USB drive. I placed it carefully at the center of the dark wood surface. I told the lead detective that my real estate empire runs on absolute security. I explained that I do not simply lease out luxury venues. I own them outright. And because I host events for some of the most powerful corporate entities in the world, every single square inch of my properties is fitted with state-of-the-art military-grade surveillance technology. The cameras, I explained, do not merely capture high-definition video, they record crystal-clear enhanced audio as well. I picked up the remote from my desk and pointed it at the wall across from the leather sofa. A massive flat-screen monitor glided silently down from a concealed panel in the ceiling. I stood, took the black USB drive, and walked to the media console. I inserted the drive and opened the primary video file. I turned back to the detectives and told them plainly I had not hired anyone to visit Paige at her motel. I had absolutely no reason to intimidate her, because I already held everything required to send her to prison. I pressed play. The massive screen came alive with raw 4K footage from the luxury bridal suite. The clarity was so sharp, it could have passed for a high-budget film production. Both detectives leaned forward, their coffee cups entirely forgotten. The video showed Paige seated at the expensive vanity mirror surrounded by her bridesmaids, the enhanced audio capturing every syllable. The detectives heard Paige snorting cocaine through a rolled-up $100 bill. They heard her loud, self-satisfied laughter. They heard her lay out in explicit detail her scheme to marry Damon solely to divorce him a year later and seize half of his supposed $50 million trust fund. The older detective's frown deepened as he uncapped his pen and began taking rapid notes. But the footage was far from finished. The video captured the precise moment Vivian opened the door and entered the suite. The camera held the quiet dignity of my wife as she set the velvet box containing a vintage sapphire brooch that had been in our family for decades on the table. The audio preserved her measured, polite request for Paige to leave the estate before her drug use became a public scandal. The footage showed with perfect clarity that Vivian never lifted a hand, never raised her voice, never made a single threatening move. It showed Paige's face curdling into a mask of pure hatred as she grasped that her enormous payday was slipping away. I paused the video and addressed the detectives. I told them that the bridal suite was only the prologue. I switched to the second file synchronized feeds from the grand ballroom. The screen divided into 4 separate camera angles, delivering a complete and irrefutable picture of the entire wedding reception. The footage showed Vivian standing quietly near the edge of the dance floor, holding a glass of sparkling water. Then it showed Paige cutting aggressively across the marble floor, shouldering past her own guests with clear, violent purpose. The detective sat in absolute silence as the high-definition camera tightened on the confrontation. There was no ambiguity. There was no obscured angle or blurred motion. The footage showed Paige raising her arm and driving a brutal, unprovoked slap directly into my wife's face. The audio caught the sharp, sickening crack of skin on skin, followed immediately by the sound of Vivian's expensive glasses shattering against the floor. The microphone suspended beneath the chandelier captured Paige screaming her contemptuous order to get out of here, old woman. But the most devastating evidence arrived just seconds later. As I knelt on the floor, drawing a clean linen pocket square from the inside pocket of my tailored suit to blot the blood from my wife's cheek, the camera caught Paige turning toward her mother, Loretta, at the VIP table. The enhanced audio pulled Paige's voice cleanly from the panicked murmurs rippling through the crowd. The detectives heard Paige whisper to her mother that she was going to call the police and claim the old woman attacked her first so they could sue me for millions. It was premeditated, malicious, and entirely undeniable. I pressed the stop button on the remote. The massive screen went black. The silence that settled over my study was heavy and complete. I returned to my desk and lowered myself into my leather chair. I lifted my coffee cup and took another unhurried sip. I looked at the two men seated across from me on the sofa. These were seasoned officers who had likely encountered every species of liar and manipulator the city of Houston had to offer. Yet they were visibly shaken by the raw, brazen audacity of the young white woman who had sat in their precinct and lied straight to their faces. The older detective closed his leather notebook and exhaled a long, slow breath. He rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the darkened screen. He knew precisely what he had just watched. He was looking at a slam-dunk felony conviction wrapped in a clean digital package. In the state of Texas, filing a false police report is a serious crime. Perjury is a crime. Possession of a schedule, one narcotic, is a crime. And unprovoked battery against a 74-year-old woman is a severe felony carrying mandatory prison time. Paige had attempted to deploy the police department as her personal weapon against my family. She had sworn under oath that I was a violent criminal, but all she had truly accomplished was digging her own grave and personally inviting law enforcement to lower her into it. She had placed in my hands the precise instrument needed to dismantle her completely and legally. The lead detective rose from the leather sofa. His entire bearing had shifted. The guarded suspicion he had carried through my front door was gone, replaced by a cold, focused professionalism. He looked at me and offered a formal apology for the intrusion. He then formally requested to take the black USB drive as official state evidence. I nodded and told him he was welcome to it. The younger detective stood beside his partner, looking almost embarrassed that they had given Paige's story even a moment of serious consideration. The lead detective unclipped his radio from his belt and keyed the transmit button, patching directly into precinct dispatch. His voice rang out clear and firm, bouncing off the mahogany walls of my quiet study. He informed dispatch that the intimidation complaint filed by Paige was a complete fabrication. He formally requested that the investigation into my family be closed at once, but he did not stop there. He instructed dispatch to locate a judge immediately to authorize an emergency arrest warrant. The target of their investigation had shifted dramatically, and the hunters were now moving straight for the motel. The wheels of justice grind slowly for the powerless, but they spin with terrifying velocity when a billionaire delivers high-definition evidence of a felony. Just 20 minutes after the detective stepped out of my study, a district court judge had signed the emergency warrant. The team was dispatched at once, but Paige was not hiding in her cheap motel room. She was constitutionally incapable of keeping a low profile. Her extreme narcissism demanded a constant audience to feed her delusions. She had taken a rideshare back to the Westwood Country Club, the very same venue where her bankrupt father had confronted my son less than a day before. It was the height of the lunch hour. The private outdoor dining terrace was packed with wealthy socialites nursing expensive champagne and pushing tiny portions of gourmet food across their plates. Paige had claimed a premium shaded table and surrounded herself with her high society circle. She was holding court. She was playing the role of the devastated bride with absolute precision. She dabbed fake tears as she rehearsed the same malicious lies she had sworn to in her police report. She told her friends that my wife was a violent monster who had attacked her out of sheer jealousy. She told them that I was a dangerous crime boss who had dispatched armed men to terrorize her in the dead of night. Her friends gasped and reached for her hand, offering hollow sympathy and validating every one of her racist delusions. Paige was basking in the warmth of their collective attention. She genuinely believed that at that very moment officers were splintering the gates of my estate and dragging me out in handcuffs. She lifted her mimosa and took a slow, satisfied sip, feeling completely untouchable and utterly superior to my family. She did not register the heavy silence that began spreading across the dining terrace like a shadow. The soft clinking of silverware and the low murmur of classical music died without warning. Two plainclothes detectives pushed through the grand mahogany doors of the clubhouse and stepped out into the sunlit terrace. They did not pause at the host stand. They did not seek permission to enter the private club. They moved with the unmistakable, unyielding weight of legal authority. The wealthy patrons stared in stunned disbelief. Law enforcement inside their exclusive sanctuary was a deeply rare and deeply unwelcome sight. The older detective swept the terrace until his eyes locked onto Paige. He and his partner walked directly toward her table, their boots striking the polished stone floor with each deliberate step. Paige finally noticed them coming. A wide, triumphant smile broke across her perfectly made-up face. She set down her crystal glass and rose from her chair, smoothing her designer dress. She turned to her friends with a supremely smug expression, certain the detectives had arrived, to personally deliver news of my arrest. She extended her hand, playing the gracious, grateful victim to perfection. She thanked the officers for their promptness and asked whether the dangerous old man was finally in custody. The older detective did not take her hand. He did not smile. He stopped exactly 2 feet away and held her gaze with undisguised contempt. He asked her to confirm her full legal name. Paige frowned briefly, thrown by his flat professional tone, but she stated her name with full confidence, fully expecting to be received like royalty. The detective gave a slow nod. He reached to his belt and unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp, metallic clack rang out across the utterly silent dining terrace. He made no effort to lower his voice for her benefit. He spoke loudly and deliberately, making certain every last wealthy patron on that terrace heard every word. He told Paige she was under arrest. He listed the charges one at a time, letting each one settle in the warm afternoon air: felony elder abuse, filing a false police report, perjury, possession of a Schedule I narcotic. The smug, triumphant smile dissolved from her face, replaced instantly by an expression of pure, undiluted terror. Her wealthy friends gasped and shoved their chairs back, physically distancing themselves as though she had become contagious. Paige began to stammer, shaking her head and fluttering her manicured hands. She insisted it was a terrible mistake. She reminded them of her sworn statement and declared herself the true victim in all of this. The younger detective stepped forward and closed his hand firmly around her left wrist. He told her there was no mistake, that they had already reviewed the high-definition 4K security footage from both the bridal suite and the grand ballroom. That single sentence broke her completely. She understood in an instant that the unedited truth was now in the possession of law enforcement, and the elaborate architecture of her lies had collapsed entirely. The polished, poised Southern belle evaporated on the spot. Paige began to scream. Not a delicate, sympathetic cry, a harsh, ugly shriek, the sound of a cornered animal realizing the trap has closed. She wrenched her arm against the detective's grip, but he held her effortlessly. He twisted both arms behind her back and snapped the cold steel cuffs tight around her wrists. The older detective began reading her Miranda rights in a loud, carrying voice. "You have the right to remain silent." But remaining silent was beyond Paige entirely. She thrashed and kicked her expensive heels against the stone floor. She screamed for her father to come save her. She screamed at her friends to do something, to call their lawyers to stop this madness. But her friends simply sat there staring at her in collective shock and revulsion. Nobody in that circle wanted any association with a hysterical woman who had assaulted an elderly person, snorted cocaine, and lied to the police. The detectives showed no deference whatsoever to her wealthy background. They gripped her firmly by both arms and marched her straight through the center of the dining terrace. It was a public humiliation, engineered to strip away every last trace of the false prestige she had spent her life constructing. The wealthy elite of Houston watched in absolute silence as the supposed princess of Savannah was walked through the country club like a feral animal. Her expensive designer dress was twisted. Her meticulously styled hair had become a tangled wreck, and black mascara was streaking heavily down both cheeks. She kicked and sobbed, begging the officers to release her, insisting she came from a good family and had no place in a filthy jail cell. They paid no attention to her pleas. They pushed her through the mahogany doors and out into the brutal, unforgiving sunlight of the front parking lot. Damon was standing there, having just stepped out of another cheap rideshare. He had come to the club to plead with Paige for forgiveness, to try against all reason to salvage his shattered, humiliating marriage. He believed an apology might still fix things. But the moment he climbed out of the vehicle, he stopped dead. He watched the heavy glass doors of the clubhouse blow open. He watched two large detectives haul his screaming wife out into the open air. He heard her swearing and thrashing, sounding completely unhinged. The pristine, immaculate image of the aristocratic white woman he had blindly worshipped shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces right before his eyes. He saw her for the first time as she truly was, a vicious, calculating criminal who had sacrificed everything to feed her own poisonous greed. He stood frozen behind a parked car, watching the detectives force her into the back of an unmarked cruiser. They slammed the door shut, swallowing her hysterical, screaming whole. The car peeled out of the country club parking lot, trailing a thin cloud of dust in its wake. Damon stood utterly alone in the sudden quiet, his heart hammering against the inside of his ribs. His entire world had been dismantled in fewer than 24 hours. He moved slowly toward the clubhouse entrance with no clear idea of what to do or where to go. As he approached the wide stone steps, one of Paige's wealthy friends came through the door, looking deeply uncomfortable. The woman was carrying Paige's expensive leather designer purse left behind on the dining chair during the violent, chaotic arrest. She shoved the bag hard into Damon's chest without a word and walked briskly away, refusing to meet his eyes. Damon stood there holding the heavy leather purse, feeling completely hollowed out and defeated. The bag was unzipped. Sitting right on top of her expensive makeup was Paige's smartphone. The screen suddenly blazed with an incoming message notification. Because she had been actively texting her friends when the police arrived, the phone had never locked. It was wide open and exposed. Damon stared at the glowing screen, The message showing on the display was from a man he did not recognize. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached into the purse and drew the unlocked device out into the hard sunlight. Damon stood entirely alone in the sweltering heat of the parking lot holding the heavy designer bag. The luxurious world he had believed was his was moving on without him. Wealthy patrons streamed past toward their expensive cars, not giving the broken man on the asphalt a second glance. He looked down again at the glowing screen of Paige's unlocked phone. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. He needed to put distance between himself and the watching valet drivers and whispering club staff. With absolutely no money for another ride share, he swallowed the last remaining fragment of his pride and dialed a number he had not called in more than 2 years. He called Terrence, an old college roommate. Terrence was someone Damon had deliberately cut from his life because Paige had decided he was too working class and too black to fit within their carefully constructed high society image. 20 agonizing minutes later, a battered blue Toyota rolled into the pristine circular driveway of the club. The engine knocked loudly, and the front bumper bore a heavy dent. It was a glaring eyesore against the parade of imported luxury vehicles surrounding it. Damon pulled the passenger door open and dropped into the worn fabric seat. Terrence did not ask a single question. He took one look at Damon's ruined suit and the hollow, devastated expression on his face, and simply shifted the car into drive. As they pulled away from the elite neighborhood and merged onto the busy downtown connector, Damon looked down at the phone still in his hands. The device remained completely unlocked. The notification that had caught his attention was a message from an unsaved number. He opened the messaging app, and his eyes fixed immediately on a long conversation thread. There was no name attached to the contact, only a profile picture. It was a handsome, wealthy-looking white man raising a champagne flute on the deck of a sailboat. Damon recognized him at once. It was Beckett, one of the groomsmen from the wedding. Beckett came from the same bankrupt aristocratic orbit as Paige's family. He was the man Paige had always described as nothing more than a close childhood friend. Damon tapped on the thread. He began reading. The words burning on the bright screen were sharp and savage. They cut through the thick, suffocating heat of the car like a blade. Damon scrolled upward through messages sent just hours before the wedding ceremony. He read messages exchanged during their supposedly romantic dinners over the past 6 months. He read every toxic secret his new wife had been concealing behind her flawless smile. Paige did not love him. She had never loved him for a single moment. Her messages to Beckett dripped with undisguised contempt for Damon and for my entire family. She called Damon a pathetic, obedient dog. She wrote that she could barely tolerate his touch, but had to play her part to secure the bag. She laughed in her messages about how breathtakingly naive Damon was, how he swallowed every lie she fed him simply because she had blonde hair and a prestigious last name. She mocked the way he dressed, the way he spoke, and the desperate hunger with which he chased the approval of her racist parents. But the insults were not even the most devastating material in the archive. Scrolling further back, Damon uncovered the precise blueprint of her financial conspiracy. Paige and Beckett had engineered the entire marriage together. Beckett had connected her with a shady corporate attorney who specialized in picking apart wealthy trust funds. Paige laid out the scheme in explicit detail across dozens of messages. She wrote that she only needed to endure being married to the stupid black heir for exactly 6 months. She explained how she would exploit the prenuptial agreement loophole alongside state community property laws to trigger a massive divorce settlement. She boasted to her lover that she intended to walk away with $25 million in tax-free cash. She promised Beckett that the moment the ink dried on the divorce papers, she would buy them a villa in the south of France, and neither of them would work another day in their lives. She even sent Beckett a photograph of herself in her custom wedding dress, with a caption that read, "Putting on my work uniform to go rob the bank." Sitting in the passenger seat of that battered blue Toyota, my son suffered a complete psychological collapse. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. His chest heaved as though the air had gone out of the world entirely. The full weight of his own blind stupidity came crashing down on him, like a structure falling in on itself. He stared through the window at the city sliding past, but he could see nothing through the tears that had finally begun to fall. He understood in that agonizing moment that everything he had thrown away had been chasing a mirage. A rapid, merciless reel of memories played through his mind. He remembered the exact instant in the grand ballroom when Paige raised her hand and struck his mother. He remembered staring down at his expensive shoes while Vivian bled on the marble floor. He had chosen to shield his wife because he believed she was his golden entry into high society acceptance. He had traded the unconditional love of the parents who had built an empire from nothing built it for him, for a woman who saw him as nothing beyond a naive and disposable payday. He remembered every time I had tried to warn him. He remembered the evenings I sat him down in my study and tried to teach him about the predatory nature of the real estate world and the dangerous people who perform friendship when money is present. I had spent 28 years constructing a fortress around him, trying to keep from his door the very predators he had eagerly welcomed into our home. And he had repaid that lifelong dedication by publicly humiliating us, by defending a violent racist, and by spitting on the legacy I had poured my blood and sweat into building. The crushing guilt and profound shame were nearly more than his body could carry. He let the smartphone slip from his fingers onto the floorboard, unable to face the hateful words for even one more second. He doubled over, burying his face in both hands, releasing a loud, agonizing sob that filled the cramped interior of the car. His friend Terrence kept his eyes fixed on the road, both hands tight on the wheel, giving Damon the wordless space to come completely undone. There was nothing to say. There was no comfort available. Damon was a man who had set fire to his own castle to impress a woman who had been holding the torch the entire time. He had forfeited his $50 million trust fund. He had surrendered his luxury penthouse. He had lost his corporate credit cards and his carefully maintained standing among the local elite. But none of those financial losses touched the real tragedy at the center of his situation. He had lost his father and his mother. He had severed permanently the only genuine bond of love and protection he had ever had. He was entirely alone in the world now, a penniless man chained to a disgraced criminal currently sitting in a jail cell. As Damon wept in the passenger seat, the thick, suffocating humidity of the Houston afternoon finally gave way. The sky over the city darkened with sudden speed. Massive charcoal-gray clouds surged in, swallowing the warm sunlight and throwing a heavy, ominous shadow across the entire skyline. The temperature fell sharply within minutes. A violent gust of wind rocked the small car, rattling the windows and scattering debris across the highway. Then the rain came. Not a soft southern shower, a full, raging thunderstorm. The heavy drops hammered the metal roof of the Toyota like thousands of tiny fists. A brilliant fork of lightning split the dark sky, followed almost instantly by a crack of thunder so deep it seemed to pass through the earth itself. The storm was a perfect mirror of the total destruction that had consumed his life over the preceding 24 hours. Damon slowly raised his head from his hands. His eyes were swollen and red, his face slick with tears. He looked out the passenger window, watching the rain sheet down the glass and blur the lights of the city into smears of color. A desperate, irrational idea began to take root in his shattered mind. He convinced himself that if he could only stand before me face to face, if he could show me Paige's text messages and explain the full depth of her betrayal, I would somehow find it in myself to forgive him. He wanted to revert to childhood, to run back to his father and have his disasters made right. He had completely forgotten the cold, final look in my eyes the moment I walked out of that boardroom. He had forgotten the absolute and immovable morality clause. He dragged the back of his trembling hand across his wet face and straightened up in the seat. He turned to Terence, his voice fractured and barely audible beneath the roar of rain and the grinding rattle of the old engine. He told his friend to change course. He told Terence to exit the downtown connector and head north. He gave him the precise address of my private gated estate in River Oaks. Terence looked over at him with visible concern, warning him that showing up unannounced in the middle of a raging thunderstorm after everything that had happened was a profoundly bad idea. But Damon would not be reasoned with. He pleaded, telling Terence it was a matter of life and death. He had to go home. He had to stand in front of the man he had betrayed and beg for a salvation that no longer existed. The battered blue Toyota took the next exit, its tires skating briefly on the slick asphalt, and drove straight into the heart of the storm, heading directly for my iron gates. The torrential thunderstorm that had swallowed the city of Houston was showing no intention of relenting. The relentless rain battered the slate roof of my River Oaks estate like a continuous rolling drumbeat. Jagged forks of lightning tore across the dark evening sky, briefly illuminating the towering ancient oak trees standing sentinel around my property. At the far end of my long cobblestone driveway, the heavy wrought iron gates rose like a wall, a physical barrier built specifically to separate my peaceful sanctuary from the turbulent world outside. I was sitting in my dimly lit study, listening to the stormwork at the thick glass windows, when the primary security monitor on my mahogany desk suddenly flared to life. The motion sensors at the front gate had picked up an approaching vehicle. I leaned forward in my high-backed chair and studied the high-definition screen carefully. A battered sedan crept into frame and stopped just inches short of the heavy black iron bars. The passenger door swung open. A figure stepped out into the freezing, blinding downpour. It was Damon. He had no umbrella, no coat. He was still wearing the same ruined designer suit from the country club that afternoon. The rain soaked through the expensive fabric in seconds, pressing it flat against his shivering frame, destroying his leather shoes in the puddles forming across the asphalt. He moved unsteadily toward the iron gates and closed both bare hands around the cold, wet bars. He tilted his head back slowly and looked straight up at the security camera mounted on the stone pillar above him. The small red indicator light on the camera confirmed it was live feeding directly into my quiet study. Damon knew I was at my desk. He knew I was watching him. He pressed his rain-soaked face against the iron bars and began to speak. The sensitive external microphones caught his voice cleanly through the dense white noise of the storm and the distant roll of thunder. He opened by calling me Dad, a word he had not used with any true and genuine feeling in several years. His voice was shaking badly, fracturing under the weight of his total despair. He told the camera that he had made a catastrophic and irreversible mistake. He said he could finally see the unvarnished truth about the woman he had married without question. He confessed that he had found her unlocked phone in her abandoned purse and read every vicious message she had sent to her secret lover. He cried out that she had plotted to rob our family from the very beginning and had not loved him for a single moment of their time together. The tears running down his face merged with the freezing rain, washing away the last remnants of the arrogance he had worn like armor. He dropped to his knees on the cold, rough asphalt, but kept his grip locked around the thick iron bars, refusing to release them. He begged for forgiveness, imploring me to press the button and open the gates and let him back into the warmth and safety of his home. He wanted to be brought inside and soothed like a frightened child. He wanted me to undo the enormous financial and social catastrophe he had willfully created. He screamed into the storm that he had been completely brainwashed by Paige and her racist, bankrupt family. He claimed they had worked on his insecurities with expert precision, making him feel ashamed of where he came from, until pleasing them became the only thing he could think about. He sobbed into the unblinking eye of the camera, saying he was deeply and profoundly sorry for what had unfolded in that grand ballroom. He swore on everything he had that he was simply paralyzed by shock in the moment his wife struck his mother, that he had not known what to do. He begged for a second chance, promising again and again that he would sign the annulment papers without delay and do whatever hard, grinding work was required to someday earn back my respect. He sounded precisely like a terrified child who had shattered something precious and was now bracing for punishment. But he was not a child. He was a 28-year-old grown man who had made a conscious and deliberate choice to stand in silence and watch his mother bleed on a marble floor. I sat motionless in my study, watching my only son disintegrate on the glowing security monitor. The quiet warmth of the room around me stood in stark and unforgiving contrast to the freezing, violent storm tearing itself apart just beyond my walls. The dark mahogany shelves and the soft gold of the desk lamp felt like an impenetrable fortress. I felt no sudden, overwhelming wave of fatherly compassion. I felt no instinctive parental pull to rush out into the freezing rain and drape a heavy coat around his trembling shoulders. That version of me, the devoted father who had endlessly sheltered his son from life's sharp edges and settled every debt he ran up, had died the instant the wedding reception was locked down. The man occupying the leather chair at that moment was simply a ruthless empire builder guarding his borders against a known threat. As I watched Damon sob uncontrollably into the camera, the heavy wooden door of my study clicked softly open. Vivian moved quietly into the room, wearing a thick, elegant cashmere sweater and cradling a warm, steaming cup of herbal tea. The crisp, white medical bandage on her right cheek stood out in stark contrast against her beautiful, flawless, dark skin. She crossed to my desk and looked down at the glowing security monitor. She saw the son she had once carried in her own womb, kneeling in the wet dirt, pleading with the camera for a salvation that no longer existed in any form. I looked up at her face, fully expecting to find tears there, or some fleeting moment of maternal softness. But Vivian was remarkably uncommon strong. The deep, searing pain of the betrayal had already scarred over inside her, hardening into a profound and permanent sense of closure. She set her porcelain cup carefully down on the wooden coaster and stepped in close behind my chair. Her warm, steady hands came to rest on my shoulders, pressing down in a gentle, reassuring squeeze of total solidarity. She did not ask me to hit the button and swing the heavy gates open. She did not ask me to step out into the storm and absolve him of his cowardly sins. She simply looked at the screen with a quiet, sorrowful acceptance of what was real. We both understood without a word passing between us that letting him back inside the estate would not be any act of genuine love. It would be a foolish act of enabling weakness, one that would only teach him his horrible cowardice carried no lasting consequence. Some bridges simply cannot be rebuilt once they have been deliberately burned to ash. I reached out and laid my large hand over Vivian's, pressing her fingers against my shoulder. I turned my eyes back to the glowing monitor. Damon was still crying hard, his wet forehead pressed against the cold iron bars. The storm outside was intensifying, the wind tearing through the old trees and rattling the camera housing on its mount. It was time to deliver the final answer. Time to cut the financial and emotional tether completely, so he could begin learning to stand on his own in the world he'd chosen. I leaned forward and pressed my index finger firmly against the heavy silver intercom button on the desk console. A crisp electronic chime rang out immediately from the speakers mounted on the stone pillars in the rain. Damon heard it and stopped crying at once. He yanked his wet head up, staring straight into the camera lens with wide, desperate eyes. He held his breath, the rain forgotten, waiting for my voice to tell him the gates were swinging open, waiting for the heavy iron to part and welcome him back into the privileged, unearned life he'd squandered. I spoke directly into the desk microphone. My voice was calm, smooth, entirely emptied of anger or hate. The external speakers threw my words out over the roar of the storm with clear, quiet dominance. I told him that an apology born entirely from the sudden loss of a trust fund is no apology at all. I told him that recognizing his wife was a manipulative criminal only after she lost her own money did not transform him into an innocent victim. It only made him a pathetic, useful fool. He opened his mouth to argue, to beg one final time for me to hear his excuses, but I did not give him the opening. I delivered the last verdict with the cold, measured precision of a judge handing down an inescapable life sentence. I said, "A man who watches his mother bleed is no son of mine. Walk away." I lifted my finger from the silver button, cutting the microphone dead and dropping the intercom back into silence. Damon stared into the camera, his bloodshot eyes wide with pure, undiluted horror. In that one terrifying second, he understood completely that my decision was final, absolute, and beyond any appeal. There would be no second chances, not tonight, not ever. No warm blankets or hot meals waiting behind those walls. He was formally, permanently exiled from the family empire. I reached out and flipped the heavy metal toggle on the security console. Power to the front gate camera was instantly severed. The live feed on my monitor flickered once and went entirely black. The digital thread between us was gone, leaving nothing but a dark screen. The blank, glowing monitor reflected only the quiet warmth of my study. Vivian leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to the top of my head, a wordless gesture of unbreakable solidarity and marital unity. I switched the monitor off completely, letting that corner of the desk fall into peaceful shadow. Beyond the iron gates, the battered blue Toyota sat idling in the pouring rain, ready to carry a broken, penniless man back into the unforgiving reality he would now face entirely on his own. Inside the warm, impenetrable walls of my estate, the personal and emotional chapter of this awful tragedy was firmly, officially closed. I released Vivian's hand and pulled open the deep bottom drawer of my oak desk. Out came 3 thick binders packed with corporate legal filings, banking records, and hostile takeover blueprints. The personal betrayal had been dealt with. The emotional rot had been cut cleanly from our lives. But the corporate war was far from finished. Gerard was still scrambling, desperately searching for some way to salvage his crumbling logistics empire. And Paige was sitting in a cold, concrete holding cell, waiting for her high-priced lawyers to construct whatever defense they could manage. I cracked open the first binder and picked up my gold fountain pen. The season of quiet grief and family reckoning was over. It was time for the corporate execution to resume. The legal machinery, massive and relentless, was turning its heavy gears, once more built and aimed to grind my arrogant enemies into dust. 48 hours is a generous amount of time for a man who fancies himself a powerful aristocrat to raise $15 million. I sat in my private office on the morning the deadline was set to expire. The sun climbed over the Houston skyline, casting long, golden light across my oak desk. I had instructed my wealth management team to monitor the proxy hedge fund accounts with absolute precision. We watched the digital ledgers as the hours quietly counted down. I knew Gerard had spent every waking moment running from bank to bank, begging wealthy country club acquaintances for emergency loans. I knew he was planted in private lounges, sweating through his expensive suits, pleading with men who had once admired him. But high society is a ruthless ecosystem. The moment blood hits the water, the other sharks do not offer a life raft. They simply circle and wait for you to go under. Gerard was discovering that his prestigious surname and his pale skin could not conjure cash when his actual corporate value had reached zero. His friends smiled warmly and offered their deepest sympathies and kept their checkbooks firmly shut. At exactly noon, the deadline expired. The digital ledger on my secure monitor sat completely blank. Not a single dollar had moved. The silence in my office was exquisite. It was the quiet, clean sound of a trap snapping shut. I did not reach for the phone. I did not ask my assistant to send any reminder. I simply authorized my lead corporate attorney, Mr. Drummond, to initiate the immediate hostile takeover. The legal machinery I had assembled across 40 years of cutthroat real estate deals roared to life with terrifying efficiency. Within 60 minutes, a fleet of black corporate vehicles pulled up to the front entrance of Gerard's failing logistics headquarters in Savannah. Mr. Drummond walked through the glass doors, flanked by 4 heavily armed private security contractors and 2 forensic accountants. They did not pause in the lobby. They marched straight into the executive boardroom, where Gerard sat with his head buried in his hands. Drummond set the formal foreclosure documents down directly on the boardroom table. The papers legally transferred full ownership of the company, the commercial fleet, and the massive supply warehouses to my proxy holding firm. The forensic accountants moved immediately to the server room to freeze all digital operations, while the security team locked down the physical assets. Gerard did not attempt to fight. He was completely broken. The security contractor standing behind his chair politely asked him to empty his pockets. They took his corporate phone, his company credit cards, and the keys to his luxury executive vehicle. Then they walked the man who had once called my son a street rat straight out the front entrance of his own building. He was made to pass hundreds of his own employees, carrying a single cardboard box of cheap office supplies. The dispatchers and warehouse workers looked on in stunned silence as their arrogant owner was marched out like a common criminal. He had to ring a cheap local taxi to carry him home because the car he'd driven to work that morning no longer belonged to him. The humiliation was profound and thoroughly deserved. But seizing his failing business was only the first step in the execution. The logistics company was merely the engine that had bankrolled his arrogance. The true foundation of his toxic pride was the vast ancestral mansion anchored in the most exclusive historic district of Savannah. It was a sprawling colonial estate, towering white pillars, ancient oaks, and a dark history built entirely on the suffering of my ancestors. Gerard and Loretta had used that house as a physical monument to their imagined genetic superiority. They hosted lavish parties in the grand gardens, looking down their noses at anyone who lacked their particular pedigree. They believed the house made them untouchable. They were completely wrong. By 4 in the afternoon, the local county sheriff arrived at the iron gates of the Savannah estate, carrying a court-ordered eviction notice. The mortgage default was absolute and the property was now legally recorded under my name. The sheriff knocked hard on the grand wooden door. Loretta answered in her signature pearl necklace and a silk robe, a glass of expensive wine in hand. When the sheriff placed the official eviction papers in her grip and told her she had exactly 2 hours to vacate the premises, she crumpled onto the porch, the glass slipping from her fingers. It shattered across the pristine stone steps, just as Paige's glasses had shattered against my wife's face. Gerard arrived in his cheap taxi just in time to watch his hysterical wife being told by armed law enforcement to pack her bags. They were forced to stuff their designer clothes into black plastic trash bags and discount suitcases, weeping openly on the manicured front lawn. Their wealthy neighbors observed from their own grand porches in horrified silence. Not one person crossed the yard to help carry a bag. The old money aristocrats stood on the sidewalk, officially homeless, waiting for another taxi. I had absolutely no intention of keeping that cursed house. I had no desire to sleep in rooms where generations of arrogant racists had lived. I had no interest in selling the property to another wealthy family who would simply perpetuate the same cycle of historical exclusion. I wanted to erase Gerard's family legacy from the face of the earth entirely. I wanted his name stripped permanently from the high society history books he had treasured so deeply. I instructed my legal team to draft a deed of complete transfer without delay. Before the sun went down that same evening, the majestic Savannah estate was officially donated to a large nonprofit organization based in Houston. The organization was dedicated to providing housing education and professional mentorship to at-risk Black youth from the inner city. I funded a permanent endowment large enough to fully renovate the colonial mansion and convert it into a sprawling, state-of-the-art community center. The grand ballroom where Loretta had staged her exclusive elitist gatherings was going to become a modern computer laboratory for young Black teenagers. The pristine, manicured gardens where Gerard had smoked his expensive cigars were going to be transformed into an agricultural learning center and a community greenhouse. The towering white pillars of the estate would no longer stand as symbols of inherited wealth and old money oppression. They would stand as a monument to the absolute triumph of the very people Gerard and his family had spent generations trying to keep at the bottom of the social order. The historical plaque at the front gate bearing his family name was ordered removed and destroyed immediately. When local news outlets broke the story about the charitable donation the following morning, the humiliation for Gerard's family became permanent and total. It was the ultimate psychological demolition. He had lost his daughter to the criminal justice system. He had lost his business to his own financial recklessness. And now the historic mansion his family had fiercely guarded for over a century was going to ring with the joyful laughter of the very children he had always despised. He had no way to strike back. He had zero legal recourse and zero money to retain a defense attorney. He and his wife were forced into a tiny rented apartment on the bleak outskirts of the city, surviving entirely on the remaining scraps of Loretta's drained personal savings. They were completely barred from the country club. Their wealthy friends stopped answering their calls, behaving as though they had never known them at all. The social isolation was profound and suffocating. Gerard had finally absorbed the most painful lesson of his entirely worthless life. He learned that real power has nothing to do with the color of your skin or the weight of your family name. Real power is the quiet, absolute ability to dismantle your enemies completely without ever once raising your voice. The corporate execution had been carried out without a flaw, leaving no financial survivors behind. Every threat he had leveled inside that country club had been methodically turned around and forced back down his own throat. He was a ghost drifting through a city he once ruled. The financial war was over, and my real estate empire stood more secure than it had ever been. I sat in my warm garden with Vivian, drinking lemonade and savoring the deep peace that only total victory can bring. We had protected our legacy from the toxic parasites who had tried to drain it dry. But the legal machinery of the state of Texas was still grinding steadily forward. While Gerard and Loretta were busy adjusting to life in a small apartment, their daughter was living a far darker reality. Paige had spent the past several weeks in the cold, damp concrete holding cell, stripped entirely of her designer dresses and expensive makeup. She had exhausted every manipulative tear and come to understand that no white knight was riding to her rescue. I set my glass of lemonade down on the patio table when my secure tablet chimed with a high-priority notification from the district attorney's office. The grand jury had officially returned a sweeping multi-count felony indictment. The notification carried the formal schedule for the upcoming legal proceedings, including the official subpoena requesting my wife to appear as the primary witness. The corporate bloodbath had concluded completely, but the criminal trial for the arrogant bride was only just beginning. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom number 4 in the Harris County Courthouse swung open. It had been exactly 3 months since the disastrous wedding reception. The crisp autumn air outside stood in sharp contrast to the stale, suffocating atmosphere inside the criminal justice building. I walked in with my beautiful wife Vivienne, holding her arm gently as we settled into our seats in the front row directly behind the prosecutor's table. I looked across the aisle at the defense table. Paige was seated there, and the transformation was jarring. The glowing, imperious bride who had demanded $50 million in a glass boardroom had vanished entirely. She looked pale and dangerously thin. No custom silk, no designer heels, because her father was entirely bankrupt, and she had been legally severed from my family's wealth. A private defense attorney was beyond her reach. She sat beside an overworked public defender in a cheap, poorly fitted gray suit that looked as though it had been pulled off a discount rack specifically for the trial. Her blonde hair had lost its expensive luster, and her hands trembled without stopping as she stared down at the scratched wooden table. The trial opened, and it became clear almost immediately how desperate her position truly was. Her public defender rose to deliver the opening statement. He was a tired man, buried under a towering stack of folders, visibly overwhelmed by his caseload. He did his level best to stitch together a narrative of sympathy for his client. He could not deny the assault. The video evidence was public, undeniable, and everywhere. So instead, he pushed an argument of temporary insanity. He told the jury that Paige was a fragile young woman crushed under severe psychological distress, brought on by the immense pressure of orchestrating a high-society wedding. He claimed she had suffered a sudden devastating mental collapse and lost all control of herself. He actually tried to argue that the toxic atmosphere of my wealthy family had pushed her to her breaking point, that she was not in her right mind when she struck my wife. It was a pathetic, insulting defense that stripped away whatever microscopic shred of dignity she still possessed. Paige sat there listening to her own attorney declare her mentally unstable, and there was absolutely nothing she could do to stop him. The prosecutor, a sharp and intensely focused woman, called Vivienne to the witness stand. The entire courtroom went absolutely silent as my wife rose from her seat. Vivienne was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit with a single elegant pearl necklace. She walked to the witness box with the unshakable composure of a queen ascending to her throne. She did not look like a frail, elderly victim. She looked like a woman of immense power and undeniable truth. She raised her right hand and swore the oath, her voice carrying clearly through the high-ceilinged room. The prosecutor began the direct examination, gently asking Vivienne to walk the court through the events of that evening. Vivienne did not cry. She did not allow her voice to waver or crack. She did not perform for the jury like a desperate actor. She simply fixed her gaze on the 12 men and women in the jury box and told them exactly what had happened. She spoke about entering the bridal suite to deliver a family heirloom. She spoke about finding Paige snorting cocaine and listening to her boast about a fraudulent scheme to drain my son's trust fund. Paige shifted in her chair, her face flushing a deep, burning crimson as her most toxic secrets were laid bare in open court. Then the prosecutor asked Vivienne to describe the physical confrontation in the grand ballroom. Vivienne recounted the moment with devastating precision. She explained how she had approached Paige quietly and asked her to leave the premises without making a public scene. She described how Paige spun around with clear, deliberate malice and delivered a full-force blow to the side of her face. Vivienne did not embellish the pain. She stated the medical facts plainly. The prosecutor approached the bench and entered the official medical records from Houston Methodist Hospital into evidence. The documents were projected onto a large screen for the jury. The emergency room physician had formally diagnosed Vivian with a severely ruptured right eardrum caused by the sheer blunt force of Paige's heavy diamond engagement ring. The injury had left her with a permanent 20% loss of hearing in that ear. The felony elder abuse charge was no longer about a simple blow to the cheek. It was now about permanent physical injury inflicted on a senior citizen. The jurors studied the medical records, then turned their eyes to Paige with expressions of unmistakable disgust. And still, the ultimate weapon had not yet been deployed. The prosecutor requested the judge's permission to play the primary exhibit. The courtroom lights dimmed. The large flat screen mounted on the wall flickered to life. I had handed the prosecution the identical 4K resolution security footage I had shown the detectives inside my private study. The jury watched the pristine, unedited video of the assault. They watched Paige's face contort into an ugly mask of hatred as she struck my wife. They heard the sickening crack of the impact through the courtroom's high-quality speakers. And most critically, they heard the enhanced audio of Paige whispering to her mother in the moments immediately following the attack. They heard her lay out her premeditated plan to lie to the police, to claim self-defense, and to sue my family for millions of dollars. The temporary insanity defense her public defender had labored to construct was instantly, completely demolished. You cannot claim a sudden mental break while simultaneously calculating a massive lawsuit and whispering a fraudulent legal strategy into your mother's ear. The video established beyond any reasonable doubt that Paige was fully lucid, entirely malicious, and absolutely guilty. The public defender rose for the cross-examination, looking like a man walking toward his own execution. He had nothing to work with. He tried a handful of mild questions aimed at rattling Vivian's composure or exposing a small crack in her timeline. He asked whether she had perhaps spoken to Paige in a threatening tone before the blow landed. Vivian looked at the weary attorney with a calm, level gaze. She replied that the truth requires no threatening tone, and that she had simply asked a trespasser to leave her property. The lawyer swallowed, gave a small nod, and sat back down without another question. He understood that pressing an elegant, composed, elderly woman whose eardrum had been ruptured on camera would only deepen the jury's contempt for his client. Before closing arguments, the judge called a brief 15-minute recess. The courtroom slowly cleared as people stretched and filtered into the hallway. I stayed in my seat beside Vivian, holding her hand. I watched Paige sit entirely alone at the defense table. Her public defender had slipped out for a cup of cheap coffee, leaving her completely unsupervised. She turned her head slowly and looked back at the public benches behind her. They were completely empty. She scanned the room for her father, hoping he would stride through the doors in his expensive suit, with his arrogant swagger, and somehow make this nightmare disappear. She looked for her mother, the comforting pearl necklace, the practiced aristocratic smile. She even looked for Damon, the foolish young man she had so ruthlessly used and discarded. But nobody came for her. The full, chilling weight of her absolute isolation settled across her pale face. The old money status she had wielded like a weapon her entire life had evaporated completely, leaving her with nothing but the cold reality of a prison sentence bearing down on her. She turned back to face the empty judge's bench, a thoroughly broken woman waiting for the final blow. The trial moved with striking speed. The prosecution rested, and the defense had no witnesses to call. Gerard and Loretta did not even appear at the courthouse to support their daughter. They were tucked away in their small rented apartment, too consumed by their own public disgrace to show their faces. Damon was nowhere to be found, having dissolved into the city after I shut the gates of my estate behind him. Paige was completely alone, abandoned by the very people she had schemed to impress and enrich. closing arguments were delivered just before the lunch recess. The prosecutor reminded the jury that wealth and social standing grant nobody the right to commit violence against the elderly. She pointed directly at Paige and named her a calculating predator who had turned the legal system into a weapon for her own corrupt greed. The public defender asked the jury for mercy, a plea that rang hollow in the silent courtroom. The judge delivered the final instructions, and the bailiff escorted the 12 jurors out to begin their formal deliberations. In complex felony cases involving substantial evidence, a jury can take days or even weeks to reach a unanimous verdict. Lawyers typically pack their briefcases and send their clients home to wait by the phone. I did not leave the courtroom. Vivian and I held our seats in the front row exactly where we had sat all morning. Paige remained at the defense table, staring blankly at the wall, her hands folded in her lap. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open just as the clock ticked past 45 minutes. The bailiff walked back in and passed a small folded note to the judge. The jury had not ordered lunch. They had not asked to review the security footage a second time. They had not requested any clarification on the legal statutes. They had reached a unanimous decision and were returning to the courtroom in under an hour. The courtroom clock marked the seconds with a slow, agonizing rhythm. 45 minutes had passed, but to the woman at the defense table, it must have felt like an eternity. Paige was staring at the heavy double doors at the back of the room, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. A nervous, desperate energy radiated off her. She still clung to some microscopic fragment of hope that her appearance and her white privilege would somehow shield her from the full consequences of what she had done. She truly believed the jury might feel sorry for her. She thought the justice system would offer her a gentle reprimand simply because she was a wealthy young woman from a historically prominent family. She had absolutely no idea that her family's historical prominence had already been wiped from the map entirely. The heavy double doors finally swung open, and the bailiff led the 12 jurors back into the silent courtroom. The atmosphere shifted instantly from anxious waiting to a suffocating, heavy tension. I reached over and took Vivian's hand gently in mine. Her skin was warm and completely steady. She did not watch the jury with fear or dread. She met them with the calm, level expectation of absolute justice. The judge, a stern older man with no patience whatsoever for courtroom theatrics, entered and settled into his seat, high on the heavy wooden bench. He asked the jury foreman whether a unanimous verdict had been reached. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with a deeply serious expression, rose and confirmed that a decision had been made. The judge instructed the defendant to stand and face the jury. Paige got to her feet on violently trembling legs. Her overworked public defender had to gently grip her elbow just to prevent her from folding right there onto the polished floor. She fixed her wide, terrified eyes on the foreman. The courtroom was so utterly quiet, you could make out the faint hum of the air conditioning running through the ceiling vents. The foreman unfolded the piece of paper and read the formal decisions aloud one by one. On the charge of filing a false police report, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of perjury, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of possession of a Schedule I narcotic, we find the defendant guilty. And finally, on the most serious charge of felony elder abuse resulting in permanent bodily harm, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty rang through that quiet room 4 separate times. With each utterance, Paige's body physically recoiled, as if struck by heavy, invisible blows. She let out a sharp, gasping breath. But the judge's gavel came down hard, demanding immediate silence. He did not dismiss the jury straight away. He looked directly down at Paige, his face entirely emptied of human sympathy. He told her he had presided over this courtroom for more than 20 years, and had watched countless violent criminals attempt to game the system for their own benefit. But he stated with absolute clarity that her case stood among the most disgusting and arrogant abuses of privilege he had ever witnessed from the bench. He told her she had deliberately tried to turn the local police department into a weapon against an innocent, elderly black woman, all to secure a massive financial payout driven by nothing but selfish, toxic greed. The judge did not choose his words carefully for her benefit. He told Paige that a civilized society rests on the fundamental principle that its elderly citizens deserve the highest respect and the fullest protection the law can provide. He stated that striking a 74-year-old woman without provocation in a highly public setting and permanently destroying her hearing was an act of profound cowardice and pure, unadulterated malice. He told her that the tears running down her face right now were not tears of genuine remorse. They were the pathetic tears of someone who had been caught and cornered by undeniable truth. He declared plainly that her privileged background, her designer wardrobe, and her prestigious family name would not shield her from the concrete reality of the cell she so richly deserved. The judge leaned forward, his dark robes casting a heavy shadow across the bench, and delivered the final, crushing blow. He officially sentenced Paige to serve 3 consecutive years in the state penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. The sentence fell over the silent courtroom like an enormous iron curtain dropping from the ceiling. 3 years. 36 months in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. Over 1,000 days on a thin mattress inside a crowded, dangerous state prison, completely stripped of her identity and every luxury she had ever taken for granted. Paige's knees buckled entirely beneath her. The exhausted public defender could no longer hold her upright, and she dropped hard into her wooden chair. Then the panic consumed her completely. 2 large, uniformed bailiffs stepped forward from the shadows carrying heavy, solid metal handcuffs. The moment they took hold of her arms and lifted her from the chair, the full, devastating reality of her vanished freedom shattered what remained of her composure. She began to scream at the top of her lungs. It was a chaotic, guttural sound of pure animalistic terror. She thrashed wildly against the firm grip of the officers, twisting her head frantically toward the empty wooden benches at the back of the room. She screamed for her father. She cried out Gerard's name over and over, begging him to use his wealth to stop the officers, to bribe the judge, to do absolutely whatever was necessary to pull his precious daughter back from the edge of a prison cell. She screamed that she did not belong in a filthy prison, and that she was a refined, educated woman from Savannah. But her screaming simply bounced off the empty wooden benches. Gerard was not there to save her, because Gerard was currently running in absolute terror for his own pathetic life. What Paige did not know was that the forensic accountants I had dispatched into his logistics company during the hostile takeover had discovered massive, glaring discrepancies buried in his digital ledgers. They had uncovered 5 years of blatant tax evasion, concealed offshore banking accounts, and extensive corporate bankruptcy fraud. I had handed those complete financial files directly to the federal authorities. That very same morning, as Paige walked into the courthouse to face her criminal trial, Gerard and Loretta had thrown whatever clothes remained into a cheap rental car and fled the state of Texas in the dead of night. They abandoned their only daughter entirely, leaving her to face the merciless machinery of the criminal justice system alone. While they scrambled desperately to outrun federal arrest warrants, the grand old money family that had sneered at my son and treated my wife like a household servant had scattered like frightened insects the moment the lights came on. They had no loyalty to anyone beyond themselves, and they left Paige to pay the full, absolute price. The bailiffs dragged Paige, kicking and screaming, down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her expensive shoes scraped loudly against the polished wood floor. She passed directly in front of the row where Vivian and I sat in complete calm silence. For one brief, flickering second, her wild and terrified eyes locked onto mine. She was staring at the quiet black man she had dismissed as a retired nobody, the dangerous man whose entire empire she had arrogantly assumed she could simply take. I did not smile at her. I did not gloat or offer any parting words. I simply looked straight through her with the cold, total indifference she had thoroughly earned. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and the officers pulled her out into the bright hallway. The thick doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off her hysterical screaming and returning the room to a dignified, complete silence. That silence was deeply, profoundly satisfying. The judge formally adjourned the court and struck his gavel one final time. The legal war was officially and completely over. The criminal trial had concluded, the prison sentence had been handed down, and the execution was absolute. I rose from the hard wooden bench and offered my right arm gently to Vivian. She gave me a warm, genuine smile and slipped her hand through my arm. We walked slowly and deliberately down the center aisle of the now empty courtroom. We did not hurry our steps, and we did not look back at the defense table. We pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the bright, clean sunlight of the late afternoon. The crisp autumn air felt remarkably fresh as we came out onto the wide concrete steps of the courthouse. The heavy, toxic, dark cloud that had hung over our family since the day of that disastrous wedding had finally dissolved completely into nothing. We had defended our empire, our dignity, and our peace of mind. The violent, arrogant cancer that had tried to take root in our lives had been cut out surgically and permanently. Paige was going to spend the next 3 years inside a concrete box, contemplating the full magnitude of her own stupidity. Her racist parents were now terrified fugitives stripped of their false prestige and their stolen wealth. And Damon, the son who had broken my heart with his cowardly silence, remained exiled, left to find his way through a harsh and unforgiving world without my money or my protection. We walked slowly down the courthouse steps toward our waiting black town car. The driver opened the rear door, and we slid into the quiet, comfortable interior. As the car pulled smoothly away from the curb and eased into the busy Houston traffic, I drew a long, deep breath of the cool, conditioned air. I looked over at Vivian and felt an overwhelming wave of profound, enduring love wash over me. The brutal war was finally behind us, but an entirely new chapter was just beginning. It was time to rebuild our massive legacy from the ground up. Time to look toward the future and establish a new normal for our family, one unburdened by ungrateful children and toxic intruders dragging us toward the bottom. 6 months have passed since the heavy courtroom doors closed on Paige's freedom. The brutal winter has dissolved into a warm, beautiful spring here in Houston. Vivian and I are sitting on the wide wraparound porch of our River Oaks estate. The afternoon air carries the sweet fragrance of blooming magnolia trees. I'm holding a tall glass of cold lemonade, and the condensation is dripping slowly down the sides of the glass. Vivian sits beside me reading a novel in the warm sunlight. Her cheek has healed completely. Though she still carries a slight, permanent hearing loss in her right ear, the deep peace that radiates from her beautiful face more than compensates for that physical scar. Our home is utterly quiet. Not the heavy, suffocating silence of a family at war. It is the deep, enduring silence of a fortress that has repelled its invaders and permanently sealed its walls. We spent the past several months carefully dismantling the old structure of our real estate empire. With no heir left to inherit the vast fortune, we chose to rewrite our legacy entirely. I brought Mr. Drummond back into my office, and together we drafted a comprehensive blind trust. Every corporate asset, every commercial property, and every liquid account has been formally transferred into a charitable foundation. When Vivian and I finally leave this earth, our billions will not flow into the pockets of ungrateful children or predatory spouses. That money will fund full academic scholarships for underprivileged Black students across the state of Texas. It will provide zero-interest loans to young minority entrepreneurs building their own businesses from nothing. We took the full weight of our wealth and returned it to the community that actually understands the meaning of hard work. We made certain our legacy builds futures rather than financing arrogance. As I sit on the porch and take a slow sip of my lemonade, a loud, rumbling diesel engine breaks the quiet as it approaches the property. I look down the long, winding cobblestone driveway. A large, battered delivery truck rolls slowly up to the heavy iron gates and comes to a stop. I set my glass down on the patio table and watch carefully. The heavy metal door of the truck slides open. A young man steps out into the bright afternoon sun. It is Damon. He is not wearing a bespoke Italian suit. He is not wearing an expensive imported watch or designer leather shoes. He is wearing a faded brown uniform shirt darkened with patches of sweat. He has on heavy steel-toed work boots worn and caked in dust. He walks around to the rear of the truck, hauls the rolling door up, and pulls a large, heavy cardboard box from the back. He carries the package up the driveway, his muscles straining under the weight of it. He looks exhausted. He looks like a man who has been grinding through a grueling minimum wage shift for 10 hours straight. He looks exactly the way I did at his age, pouring concrete and breaking my body just to survive. Damon walks up to the iron gates and gently sets the cardboard box down on the stone pillar. He does not press the intercom bell. He does not drop to his knees in tears. He does not beg for entry or ask for his platinum credit cards back. He simply stands up straight and wipes the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looks directly up at the security camera mounted on the wall. He knows I am watching. He holds my gaze through the lens for a long, quiet moment. Then he gives a single, slow, respectful nod. It is not a plea for mercy. It is an acknowledgement of reality. He turns, walks back to the delivery truck, climbs into the hot cab, and drives off down the quiet suburban street to finish his route. I do not reach for the button to open the gates. I stay in my chair on the porch, but a quiet, genuine smile spreads slowly across my face. My son is finally learning what it means to be a real man. Stripping away his unearned millions was the most painful thing I have ever done as a father. But it was also the greatest gift I could have given him. He is finally learning the true value of $1. He is learning the real weight of cowardice and the unforgiving nature of the world. Justice has been entirely served. This entire ordeal has left me with a profound and unshakable understanding of truth. Blood may determine who you are related to, but unwavering loyalty determines who your family truly is. For generations, society has conditioned older people to absorb disrespect in silence, to preserve the peace, treating our sacrifices as obligations and our boundaries as something to be negotiated away. But peace purchased just at the cost of your own dignity is nothing more than a prison wearing a comfortable disguise. Thank you for staying with me all the way through this one. Stories like this one don't leave you easily, and they're not supposed to. What this cost me was enormous. It cost me the version of my son I had always hoped he would become. It cost Vivian her peace of mind for a long season of her life, and a piece of her hearing she will never get back. But what it gave us was something that cannot be bought or inherited. It gave us clarity. I believe God does not waste our pain, not a single sleepless night of it. The Lord's timing has a way of placing the truth exactly where it needs to land, at exactly the right moment. Here is what I want you to carry with you from this story. Never allow the love you have for someone to blind you to the evidence they are laying right in front of you. Love hard, but keep your eyes open. If someone only apologizes after they lose something, that is not remorse, that is damage control. Learn the difference. Build your legacy for a purpose larger than the people who might inherit it. Wealth without wisdom is just a weapon waiting for the wrong hands. And finally, your dignity is not negotiable. The moment you accept disrespect to keep the peace, you have handed your power to the wrong person. If this story moved, you leave a comment below and tell me what part stayed with you the longest. Share it with someone in your life who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already subscribed to Family Revenge Stories, there are more stories just like this one waiting for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the people who have truly earned your trust.